Every rookie gets the garbage assignments, and in the summer of 2023, mine was traffic enforcement on County Road 12. Specifically, a four-way stop in the middle of nowhere that locals had been blowing through like it was a suggestion. The intersection was known as Ghost Hollow. It was a fitting name. The roads were narrow, lined with ancient overgrown oak trees that formed a dark canopy even during the day. At night, it was a pocket of absolute blackness, surrounded by dense woods and a couple of farmhouses that had been abandoned for decades. There was a story, of course. Years ago, a young woman had gone missing, and her car was found abandoned right at that intersection, door ajar, engine cold. They never found her. It was the kind of place that held its breath. My sergeant assigned me the spot for the graveyard shift, from midnight to 6. The goal was to write a few tickets and hopefully slow people down. But after 2 a.m., traffic on that road dwindled to nothing. I was parked in a small gravel turnout, engine idling, with a perfect view of the stop sign. For hours, my world was the green glow of the dashboard, the low hiss of the radio, and the oppressive, silent darkness outside. I was fighting to stay awake, sipping on lukewarm coffee and trying to make the time pass. It was somewhere around 3 in the morning when I saw the first flicker of movement. I was doing a routine scan of my mirrors, a habit drilled into you at the academy. In my rear view, I caught a flash of motion. Something dark and incredibly fast shot across the road behind my patrol car, moving from the woods on the right to the woods on the left. It was a complete blur. My first thought was a deer, but it was too low to the ground and moved with a silent, fluid speed that was unlike any animal I had ever seen. It was there and gone in an instant. I shook my head, blaming my tired eyes. I became more alert after that, my senses heightened. I kept scanning the dark tree line, looking for whatever it was. A few minutes passed, and the silence returned. I started to relax, convincing myself I had imagined it. That was when it appeared again. This time, it was not behind me. In my driver's side mirror, I saw a shape of pure blackness rush up along the side of my car. It was not a running person. It had no distinct form or limbs. It was more like a shadow that had detached itself from the ground. It flowed from the rear bumper to the front fender in less than a second. A silent vertical blur that filled my mirror and was gone. My heart was now a frantic drum against my ribs. This was not my imagination. This was real. My hand went to the grip of my service weapon on my hip. I stared out my driver's side window into the impenetrable darkness, but there was nothing. No sound of footsteps on the gravel, no cracking twigs. Absolute silence. Before I could even radio in what I was seeing, it moved to the front. The shadow glided out from the driver's side and flowed across the hood of my car. It was not a projection. It was a solid, three-dimensional mass of darkness that blotted out the faint starlight reflecting off the paint. It moved with an unnatural, liquid grace, not touching the car but hovering just above it. For a horrifying fraction of a second, it paused directly in front of my windshield, and I was overcome with a terrifying, absolute certainty that it was aware of me, that it was looking at me from within that formless void. Every primal instinct I possessed screamed at me to flee. I was no longer a police officer on duty. I was prey. I did not think. I reacted. I slammed the gear shift into drive and stomped on the accelerator. The engine roared and the tires screamed on the asphalt as I shot out of the gravel turnout and onto the road, away from that haunted intersection. I did not look in my rearview mirror. I did not want to know if it was following. Our patrol cars have dash cams that are set to start recording automatically when the vehicle exceeds a certain speed. The violent acceleration would have triggered it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel, but I needed to see. I needed proof. I drove for a few miles until I reached a well-lit stretch of road and pulled over. With a trembling finger, I accessed the camera's playback function. The footage began, showing the dark, empty intersection from my parked position. The video was clear. Then, I saw the moment I hit the gas. The car lurched forward. at the exact instant that the shadow should have been visible flowing across my hood. The video feed cut to 2 seconds of pure, absolute black. It was not static or a glitch. It was as if a thick, black cloth had been thrown over the lens, blocking out all possible light. Then, just as abruptly, the image returned, showing the empty road ahead as I sped away into the night. The next day, I told my sergeant the spot was a waste of time, that there was not enough traffic to justify the assignment. He grunted and gave me a new location. I never told anyone the real reason I refused to go back. I have faced down armed men and walked into violent, chaotic scenes without hesitation. That is a danger I can understand and confront. But the thing I saw that night at Ghost Hollow was different. It was something ancient and wrong, a silent shadow that did not obey the rules of our world. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to this day, that it is still out there, watching that lonely crossroads in the dark. I have always been a pragmatic person, someone who believes in what I can see and touch. The idea of past lives or reincarnation always seemed like something for other people, a fanciful notion without any real-world basis. But a few years ago, in 2021, I found myself in a strange place in my life. I felt disconnected, as if I were drifting without an anchor. A friend suggested I try past life regression, using a guided meditation she found online. I was skeptical, to say the least, but I was also desperate for some kind of clarity, so I decided to give it a try. I did not expect much to happen. I lay on my bed one evening, with my headphones on, listening to a calm voice telling me to relax and let my mind drift back in time. At first, it was just darkness, the usual jumble of thoughts and half-formed images. But then, something shifted. The darkness gave way to a dimly lit room, and I was no longer in my own body. I was looking through someone else's eyes. I was standing in a bedroom, facing a large, dark wood dresser. It was an old-fashioned piece of furniture, with an ornate mirror attached to the back and a wardrobe built into one side. The room had a distinct smell of old wood, wool, and a faint hint of cigar smoke. I looked at the items scattered on top of the dresser, a heavy silver watch, a fountain pen, and a collection of loose change. A strange feeling washed over me, a powerful sense of familiarity. These are my things, I thought, with a certainty that was startling. My eyes were drawn to a particular object, a heavy brass cigar lighter. It was the kind you might see on a desk in an old black and white movie from the 1930s or 40s. I reached out and picked it up. My hand, the hand I saw in this vision, was not my own. It was a man's hand, older and more callous than mine. I flicked the lighter's mechanism a few times, but it just made a dull clicking sound. It would not light. Then, a thought popped into my head. My name is on the back. I turned the lighter over, and sure enough, there was an engraving. The script was elegant but blurry. I squinted, trying to make it out, but the letters swam before my eyes. I could not read the name. Putting the lighter down, I turned my attention to the wardrobe section of the dresser. I opened the doors, and the smell of mothballs hit me. Inside, there was a row of suits, at least a dozen of them. They were in styles from the 1950s or 60s, heavy wool suits for daily wear. Above them, on a high shelf, was a small, dusty cardboard box. Curious, I reached up and pulled it down. I opened it, and inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cotton, were 2 badges or patches. They were triangular, made of some kind of stiff fabric, with a letter embroidered in the center. As I looked at them, another thought came to me, clear as a bell. These are my old civil defense badges. The dream, or vision, or whatever it was, ended abruptly. I was back in my own bed, in my own time, my heart pounding in my chest. The details were already starting to fade, but the image of those badges and the words civil defense were burned into my mind. I sat up and immediately asked myself, What on earth is civil defense? I had never heard the term before. I grabbed my laptop from my nightstand and typed it into a search engine. The results flooded my screen. It was a civilian organization that was active during World War II and the Cold War, tasked with helping the public during emergencies like air raids. I scrolled through images of old posters and pamphlets, and then I saw it. It was an insignia, an embroidered patch identical to the ones in the box from my dream. It was a white triangle with a letter in the center, the official insignia of the Civil Defense Auxiliary Police. A shiver went down my spine. There was no way I could have known that. It was not something I had ever learned in history class or seen in a movie. I tried the regression exercise a few more times over the next few weeks, but only one other time did anything happen. It was a much shorter, foggier vision. I was standing by the bleachers at a baseball field. I could smell hot dogs and freshly cut grass. The sun was warm on my face. A few feet away, two men in dark suits and fedoras were talking in low voices. I could not make out what they were saying, but I had the distinct impression that I was waiting for them, that I was somehow involved in their conversation. Then, just as quickly as it started, it was over. I still do not know what to make of these experiences. Was my mind just creating elaborate stories from fragments of things I had seen or heard throughout my life? Or did I truly catch a glimpse of a life I lived before my own? I am a pragmatic person, but I cannot logically explain how I knew about the specific insignia of the Civil Defense Auxiliary Police. That detail is too precise, too obscure to be a coincidence. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about that room, about the man whose eyes I looked through. I wonder what his name was on the back of that lighter, and what stories those old suits in the wardrobe could tell. It is a strange feeling, to be haunted not by a ghost, but by the faint echo of a life that might have once been my own. I worked as an EMT for over 2 decades. In that time, I saw the full spectrum of human experience, from the miraculous to the mundane to the utterly monstrous. You develop a thick skin, a gallows humor, a way of processing the trauma so it doesn't consume you. But there are some calls, some weekends, that are so relentlessly grim they manage to leave a permanent mark. I once had a 48-hour stretch of shifts that contained 3 calls that have stayed with me ever since, each one a different flavor of horror. The weekend started on a Friday night, with a dark, steady rain that seemed to wash all the color from the world. My partner and I were just starting to doze off at the station when we got a call for a hit and run. We arrived to find a man lying in the road, a crumpled heap in the glare of our headlights. He was barely breathing. We did our work, the familiar frantic choreography of checking vitals, applying pressure, getting him onto the stretcher and into the back of the ambulance. His leg was a mess, mangled and clearly beyond saving. We rushed him to the hospital and handed him over to the emergency room staff. The last I heard, they had to amputate the leg. It was a tragic, but not entirely uncommon call. A few years passed. I was working with a different partner, but we were at the same station. We got a similar call, a hit and run on the same stretch of highway. As we pulled up, a chilling sense of déjà vu washed over me. It was the same guy. He had lost one leg the last time, and now his other leg was completely mangled. We loaded him into the ambulance and took him to the same hospital. The same ER doctor was on duty. He looked down at the patient, then up at us, and said, "Déjà vu, huh?" It was a bizarre, grim coincidence. I followed up on the case later and learned that the man had indeed lost his other leg. He was a local alcoholic who, even after losing one leg, insisted on taking a shortcut home from the bar by crossing the dark highway. He had been fitted with a prosthetic and had managed for a while, but his luck finally ran out. It was a sad, strange story of a man's life being destroyed, piece by piece, by the same mistake. The second call of that weekend came late Saturday afternoon. The dispatch was vague, just a request for a wellness check alongside the police. Neighbors had heard disturbing noises coming from the house next door. When we arrived, we could hear it too. A man shouting and the rhythmic, heavy sound of something battering against a door. The police went in first. What we found inside was sickening. A little girl, no older than 8, had barricaded herself in her bedroom. Her stepfather, drunk and enraged, had been trying to break down the door with a hammer. If the police had arrived a few minutes later, I have no doubt he would have killed her. The mother had just stood by and let it happen. We went in to check on the child. Her room was dark, filthy, and smelled of human waste. She was cowering in a corner, a tiny, terrified creature. Apart from some bruises and cuts, she was physically unharmed, but she was severely malnourished. Her face was gaunt, her skin had a ghostly pallor, and her eyes looked like they belonged to a 50-year-old who had seen a lifetime of horror. There was no light, no childhood innocence left in them. We took her out of that house, and I never saw her again. I heard her mother and stepfather got long prison sentences, but you lose track of the children who enter the system. I can only hope that she found a safe place, and that somewhere she is okay. The final call came in the dead of night on Sunday, just a few hours before our shift was supposed to end. It was the strangest of the 3. Dispatch told us they had received a call from a landline at an old woman's house. The woman had simply requested an ambulance and then hung up. We pulled up to the house, a small, dark shape set back from the road. There were no lights on. We knocked on the door and got no reply. We walked around the property, peering into the dark windows, but there was no sign of anyone. We knocked again, louder this time, announcing ourselves. As we were about to turn away and call for police backup, the front door slowly creaked open on its own. A cold shiver went down my spine. We weren't supposed to enter a residence like this without police, so we backed away and called it in. A few minutes later, a patrol car arrived. The officers went in first, their voices echoing in the silent house as they announced their presence. After a thorough search, they found no one inside. We went in after them and did our own search, but the house was completely empty. Dispatch confirmed that the call had originated from that exact residence. We never found out what happened. Was it a prank? A technical glitch with the phone lines? Or was it something else? A ghost in the machine, or a ghost in the house? That call, more than any other, left me with a deep sense of unease. The violence and tragedy of the other calls were understandable, in a grim sort of way. But the mystery of that last call, the complete absence of an explanation, was a different kind of horror altogether. Before I became a cop, I worked a string of dead-end jobs to pay my way through college. One of the worst was being an overnight security guard at the main branch of the city library. It wasn't a security job in the traditional sense. I was unarmed. My primary role was to be a uniformed deterrent and to call the real police if anything happened. The library had a policy of being open to everyone, which meant that on any given night, it was a strange mix of students cramming for exams, insomniacs looking for a quiet place to read, and a significant portion of the city's homeless population seeking shelter from the elements. Most nights were mind-numbingly boring, but you always had to stay alert. There was one guy who was a regular. We called him the Colonel because he was always dressed in an old tattered army jacket and was constantly muttering to himself about military history and battlefield tactics. He was harmless, one of the many broken but gentle souls who haunted the library's quiet corners. One night, the Colonel came in, but he was different. His usual shuffling gait was replaced by a rigid, purposeful stride. His eyes, normally downcast, were wide and scanning the room. He didn't go to his usual spot in the history section. Instead, he sat down at a large table in the main reading room, directly across from the front desk where I was posted. He set his worn-out backpack on the table and from an inside pocket of his jacket produced a prescription pill bottle. He shook out a handful of large white tablets. Then he took a heavy hardback book, a biography of General Patton, and, with a series of loud, sharp cracks that echoed through the silent library, he crushed the pills into a fine powder. He used his library card to scrape the powder into a single thick line. He then leaned down and snorted it with a loud, wet gasp. My training, what little I had, dictated that I had to intervene. I walked over to his table, my footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the polished floor. "Colonel," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "you can't do that in here. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He didn't look up. He was staring at the residue on the table. "Just deploying my troops," he mumbled, "getting the field ready for battle." "The library's closing soon anyway," I lied, trying a different tactic. "It's time for everyone to go." That's when he looked up at me. His eyes were blazing with an intensity I had never seen before. He leaned across the table and his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "You're a guard," he said, "but you're not a soldier. You have no weapon. I, on the other hand," he patted his backpack, "I have a suppressed 9mm pistol in this bag. Standard issue for covert operations. It makes very little noise. No one would even hear. Not you, not the librarian." The world seemed to shrink to the space between me and him. The air went out of my lungs. He wasn't the colonel anymore. He was a man who had just credibly threatened my life and the life of the only other person in the building, a sweet, elderly librarian named Mary. I backed away slowly. "Okay," I said, holding my hands up in a placating gesture. "Okay, just be cool." I walked back to the front desk, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I picked up the phone and, shielding my mouth, whispered to Mary, who was in the back office. "Mary, lock your door and call 911. There's a man out here with a gun." The next 10 minutes were the most terrifying of my life. It was just me and him in that vast, silent room. He didn't make any sudden moves. Instead, he started a bizarre, methodical ritual. He began taking books from a nearby cart and re-shelving them in the wrong sections. A cookbook in the science fiction aisle. A children's book in with the legal texts. All the while, he hummed an old, discordant marching tune, occasionally glancing over at me with a small, knowing smirk. It was a psychological game, and it was shredding my nerves. I was trapped, a completely powerless observer in my own potential crime scene. Finally, he seemed to grow bored. He packed up his bag, stood up, and walked toward the exit. He paused right in front of my desk. "The first wave has been repelled," he said, his voice back to its usual mumble. "But the war is far from over." Then he walked out into the night. The police arrived a few minutes later, their presence filling the library with a comforting sense of authority. They found the colonel about a block away. They searched him and his bag. There was no gun. There had never been a gun. The powder was his prescribed antipsychotic medication, which he was supposed to be taking orally. The threat was imaginary, but my terror was not. That night taught me that a weapon doesn't have to be made of steel to be effective. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon is a single sentence, planted in the right place, at the right time. I was a state trooper assigned to a post in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a place so remote and sparsely populated that you can drive for an hour without seeing another car. In the winter, it's a different world entirely. The lake effect snow comes down in blinding sheets, burying everything in a silent white blanket. The isolation is absolute. You learn to rely on yourself because your closest backup is often on the other side of a blizzard. It was a Tuesday night in the dead of January, and a storm was raging. The wind howled like a hungry animal, and the snow was coming down so thick I couldn't see the end of my patrol car's hood. I was parked at a closed gas station, the only light for miles coming from my dashboard. Around 3 a.m, my radio crackled to life. It was dispatch, and the operator's voice was tight with an anxiety that cut right through the static. She had received a 911 hang-up call. The call was traced to a landline at an old, long-abandoned hunting lodge deep in the state forest, about 15 miles from my position. The line had been open for less than 30 seconds. There was no screaming, no struggle, just the sound of what she described as wet, ragged breathing. and then a click. An open line from a place that shouldn't have a working phone was strange enough. The sound she described made it chilling. Every other trooper on duty was tied up with a massive pileup on the main highway, 100 miles south. It was just me. I radioed back that I was en route, my heart sinking as I said the words. Heading into that forest in this storm, alone, was the last thing I wanted to do. The drive was a nightmare. The road to the lodge was an unplowed 2-track trail. My SUV's 4-wheel drive fought for every inch of traction, the tires spinning and biting at the deep snow. The trees, heavy with ice and snow, loomed over the trail like skeletal giants, their branches creaking and groaning in the wind. More than once, I thought about turning back, about telling dispatch it was impassable. But the thought of that wet, ragged breathing kept me going. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. The lodge was a dark, hulking shape against the swirling snow, a 2-story log structure sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. I parked as close as I could, my headlights cutting a path through the storm to the front porch. I got out, the wind immediately stealing the breath from my lungs. The snow was almost to my knees. I trudged to the front door, my flashlight beam dancing across the frosted-over windows. "Michigan State Police," I yelled, my voice swallowed by the storm. "Anybody in there?" The only reply was the screech of the wind. I pounded on the thick wooden door, the sound a dull thud. "I know someone's in there. We got a 911 call." I backed away from the porch, my light sweeping across the front of the lodge. I felt a deep, primal sense of being watched. My eyes were drawn to a small, circular window high up in the attic gable. For a second, I thought I saw a face, a pale oval in the darkness. I blinked, and it was gone. Was it a trick of the light and the swirling snow? I got on the radio, my hands clumsy with cold, and updated dispatch. I told them I had a feeling someone was inside and that I'd have to force entry, but that I was going to wait for backup. The dispatcher's voice was apologetic. The roads were a mess. It could be over an hour, so I waited. An hour, alone in a blizzard, staring at a haunted house. The wind played tricks on me, making the old lodge groan and settle. I kept hearing things. A scraping sound from inside, the faint thud of something falling. I kept my eyes on that attic window, half expecting, half dreading to see the face again. My mind started to wander. Who would be out here? A lost hunter? A squatter? Or something worse? Finally, I saw the faint glow of headlights approaching. It was Sergeant Reynolds, a grizzled veteran who had seen everything. He pulled up behind me, and together we approached the house. We announced ourselves one last time, and when there was no answer, we made the decision. We used a battering ram from his trunk, and it took 6 heavy blows to splinter the frozen door and crash it open. We drew our sidearms and stepped inside. A blast of frigid, stale air hit us. It smelled of mildew, rot, and something else. Something coppery and vaguely animal. Our flashlight beams cut through the thick darkness, revealing a main room frozen in time. Furniture was draped in dusty white sheets like a room full of ghosts. Animal heads were mounted on the walls, their glass eyes seeming to follow our lights. We cleared the first floor room by room. Nothing. The only sound was the crunch of our boots on the debris-littered floor. As we approached the bottom of the wide log staircase leading to the second floor, a shape detached itself from the shadows above. It was a man, and he didn't walk or run. He launched himself from the second floor landing, landing silently on the stairs below in a low crouch, like a predator. He was tall and unnaturally thin, almost skeletal. He wore the tattered remains of old hunting clothes, and his long matted hair hung over a face that was pale and sunken. His eyes glowed in our flashlight beams, reflecting the light like a nocturnal animal. "State Police. Freeze," Reynolds commanded. The man just smiled, a wide, lipless grin that showed yellowed teeth. He let out a low growl and charged down the stairs at us. Reynolds deployed his taser, and the man screamed, a high, piercing shriek that was barely human, before he convulsed and crashed to the floor. We cuffed him, and the entire time he was rambling, his voice a hoarse whisper. He talked about the hunger and the man of ice who walked between the trees. In the back of my patrol car, he was unnervingly calm. He sat perfectly still, staring out at the swirling snow, occasionally whispering to someone who wasn't there. Back at the post, he wouldn't give us his name. He just sat in the interrogation room, humming a tuneless, discordant melody. Later that day, 2 US Marshals showed up. Our mystery man was a fugitive, wanted for a string of kidnappings and murders spanning 3 states. He was a survivalist who would abduct people and take them into the wilderness. They were never seen again. As the marshals led him out in chains, he stopped and looked directly at me. His eyes were clear and focused for the first time. "The hunger is patient," he whispered, his lipless grin returning. "It will wait for you in the snow." On my beat, there was a building that was a character in itself, the Orpheum Grand. Built in the Roaring '20s, it was a magnificent old movie palace, a place of velvet seats, gilded plasterwork, and a soaring ceiling painted with constellations. By the time I was a cop in 2023, its glory days were long gone. It was a decaying, city-owned relic, used mostly for storing old municipal records and occasionally rented out for amateur theatre productions. It was also, according to every officer who worked the graveyard shift, profoundly haunted. The calls for the Orpheum were a regular part of our nightly routine. An alarm company would phone in a motion sensor trip in the main lobby or the balcony. It happened so frequently that the city had given our precinct a set of keys to the building, just to save the property manager the trouble of getting out of bed at 3 a.m. Most of the time, we would find nothing. A draft, a mouse, a settling of the old foundation. But even on those quiet nights, the place had a personality. You would stand in the center of the vast, empty theater, and in the thick, oppressive silence, you would hear the distinct creak of a seat folding down in the darkness, as if an unseen patron was making themselves comfortable. You would hear what sounded like faint whispers carried on the drafts from the cavernous attic space. We all got used to it. It was just the Orpheum being the Orpheum. One night in November, however, was different. It was cold, with a wind that howled around the corners of the old building. My partner at the time was Leo, a young officer who was still new enough to be spooked easily. We got the familiar call, motion sensor, main lobby. When we pulled up, we immediately knew something was off. One of the heavy, ornate side doors, a door that was always bolted from the inside, was standing slightly ajar, a black slice of darkness against the brickwork. Protocol meant we had to clear the building. We pushed the door open and stepped inside, into the familiar smell of dust, mildew, and something that reminded me of stale popcorn. The air was frigid. We drew our weapons, our flashlight beams dancing nervously through the cavernous darkness, illuminating swirling dust motes. We started with the lobby and then moved into the main auditorium, our footsteps echoing unnervingly in the huge space. As we made our way down the aisle toward the stage, Leo let out a strangled yelp and froze. His flashlight beam was fixed on the orchestra pit. I swung my light over and saw it, a figure standing silently in the shadows. My heart jumped into my throat before I realized it was a mannequin left over from some long-forgotten play, dressed in a dusty, tattered tuxedo. We both let out a breath of relief, laughing nervously at our own jumpiness. But as we stood there, our laughter died in our throats. From the darkness right behind us, we both heard a clear, distinct whisper. It was not the wind. It was a voice, sibilant and genderless, muttering something we could not understand. We spun around, flashlights sweeping the empty rows of seats. There was nothing there. We pressed on, our nerves frayed. The sense of being watched was overwhelming now. We moved backstage into a maze of narrow corridors, cluttered dressing rooms, and shadowy storage areas. The sounds became more frequent, more distinct. The soft shuffle of feet from the floor above, the distant but unmistakable sound of a heavy door creaking open and then closing. We came to a long, narrow room lined with floor-to-ceiling metal shelves. It was the costume storage. The shelves were crammed with dozens of cardboard boxes, their contents spilling out. Feathered hats, sequined gowns, moth-eaten furs. The air was thick and stagnant. I was in the lead, moving cautiously down the tight aisle between the towering shelves, with Leo right behind me. The only sound was the crunch of our boots on the dusty floor. It was dead silent for a long moment, a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Suddenly, a large box on a shelf right beside Leo shot outwards, as if it had been violently shoved from behind. It flew through the air and crashed onto the floor, exploding in a shower of old fabric and plumes of dust. Leo completely lost his composure. He let out a piercing scream, a sound of pure terror, and raised his weapon, nearly firing a volley of shots into a pile of antique dresses. His panic was a live wire. I grabbed his arm, yelling his name, and pulled him back. As we scrambled out of the room, the whispers started again, but this time they were not faint. They were all around us, a chorus of overlapping, unintelligible voices coming from the darkness, seeming to laugh at our fear. We did not finish the sweep. We backed our way out of the backstage area, through the silent auditorium, and out the side door, into the blessedly cold, clean night air. We locked the door, our hands shaking, and got back into the patrol car. Neither of us said a word on the drive back to the station. In our report, we wrote that we had found an open door, cleared the building, and secured it. We left out the part about the flying box and the chorus of whispers. But from that night on, there was an unspoken rule on our shift. No one went into the Orpheum Grand with anything less than a 4-officer team. The old theatre still stands on my beat, a dark and silent monument, and whenever I drive past it, keep my windows rolled up, because I know that if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the whispers carried on the wind. I used to be a sheriff's deputy in a small, isolated county on the coast of Maine. We were the only law enforcement for about 100 square miles of dense forest, rocky coastline, and tiny, forgotten hamlets. It was the kind of place where the permanent population was less than 1,000, and everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. Most of the time, my job was dealing with minor disputes, tourists who got their cars stuck in the mud, and the occasional drunk fisherman. But the isolation had a dark side. When something truly bad happened, you were on your own. Backup could be 45 minutes away, and that's if the weather was good, which it rarely was. This particular night in November, a cold, biting rain was coming down, mixed with a thick fog that rolled in off the Atlantic. It swallowed up the headlights of my patrol car, reducing my visibility to just a few feet. It was around 2 in the morning, the dead hour when the world feels like it belongs to ghosts. I was parked on the side of a deserted road, nursing a lukewarm coffee, when a call came in from dispatch. It was a hang-up, a 911 call from a landline registered to a derelict property on the far edge of our county. The dispatcher, a woman named Carol, who'd been on the job for 30 years, sounded uneasy. She said the call had lasted only 13 seconds. There was no voice, just an open line, but right before it disconnected, she thought she heard a faint, wet whisper. She couldn't make out any words. Ordinarily, a hang-up from a vacant property might be chalked up to a line issue, especially in a storm. But something about the way Carol's voice wavered made the hair on my arms stand up. Every other deputy on shift was tied up on the other side of the county with a multi-car pile-up on the main highway. It was just me. I drove down the winding, unpaved logging roads that led to the property. The rain hammered against my windshield, and the thick forest pressed in on both sides, the tall pines like silent, watching giants. The farmhouse was even worse than I had imagined. It was a 2-story wooden structure that had been abandoned for at least a generation. The paint was long gone, the wood weathered to a skeletal grey. Most of the windows were boarded up, but a few were just black, gaping holes. The yard was a graveyard of rusted farm equipment, half swallowed by weeds and mud. It looked like a place that had died and been left to rot. I parked my car, letting the headlights illuminate the front of the house, and got out. The cold, wet wind cut right through my jacket. I unlatched the mouldy gate, which groaned in protest, and walked up the muddy path to the front door. I knocked hard, the sound echoing flatly in the night. "Sheriff's office!" I yelled. "Is anyone here?" The only answer was the sound of the wind and the rain. I waited for a long minute, my hand resting on the grip of my holstered pistol. I knocked again, louder this time. "This is Deputy Carter. I need you to open the door. We received a 911 call from this residence." Still nothing. I felt a profound sense of being watched. I backed away from the porch, my boots sinking into the soft mud, and scanned the upper windows of the house. That's when I saw him. In a high, narrow attic window that wasn't boarded up, a face was looking down at me. It was pale and gaunt, with long, stringy hair plastered to its forehead by the rain that was leaking through the broken pane. The eyes were what got me. They were dark, sunken pits, but they seemed to burn with a cold intensity. My blood turned to ice. I pulled out my flashlight, the powerful beam cutting through the fog, and shined it on the window. The face disappeared instantly. "Sir, I see you," I shouted, my voice straining to sound authoritative. "You need to come down and open the door. I have more officers on the way." I got on the radio and informed dispatch that I had visual confirmation of a person inside the property. I requested backup, telling them I would need to make a forced entry. Carol's voice came back, strained. "Understood. The closest unit is coming from the pile-up. ETA is at least 25 minutes. 25 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. I retreated to the relative safety of the gate, keeping my eyes fixed on the house, my flashlight beams sweeping across the windows. I didn't want to get too close, but I couldn't leave. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of the wind in the trees, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. A few minutes into the wait, I saw a flicker of movement behind one of the downstairs windows. A shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows within. Was he coming to the door? Or was he moving to another part of the house, looking for another way out? The wait was excruciating. I was alone, miles from anywhere, in a storm, with a man of unknown intentions hiding in a decaying house. Finally, I saw the blessed sight of flashing lights cutting through the fog. 2 other deputies, Barnes and Miller, pulled up. Barnes was a big, intimidating guy with a booming voice and little patience. I quickly brought them up to speed. Barnes strode up to the front door. "Sheriff's office!" he bellowed. "You have one final chance to open this door before we open it for you." He waited for about 10 seconds, then turned to us. "All right, let's do it." Miller went back to his trunk and retrieved the ram, what we called the big red key. Together, he and Barnes slammed it against the old wooden door. It took 4 solid hits before the door splintered and crashed inwards. We drew our weapons and entered, our flashlight beams cutting through the dusty, stagnant air. The place smelled of rot and damp earth. The floor was littered with broken glass and debris. "Sheriff's office, show yourself with your hands in the air." Barnes's voice echoed in the empty living room. We cleared the downstairs, finding nothing but cobwebs and decay. As we turned our lights toward the crooked, rickety staircase, a figure launched itself from the upper floor. He didn't come down the stairs. He jumped, landing on the staircase with a loud crack of splintering wood, crouched like an animal. It was the man from the window. He was emaciated, covered in grime, and his eyes were wide with a terrifying, feral madness. "Sir, get your hands up," I yelled. But before I could finish, he charged down the stairs, screaming a string of incoherent words. "Taser, taser, taser," Miller shouted, and the man let out a gut-wrenching shriek as the probes hit him. He convulsed and collapsed in a heap at the bottom of the stairs. We swarmed him, struggling to get him in handcuffs as he rambled on about a big man who brought him food every day. The ride back to the station was the strangest part of the night. I put him in the back of my car. As I was reading him his rights, he kept looking at the empty passenger seat next to me and telling his ex-wife to stop being rude. At one point, he began arguing with the empty seat, his voice rising in anger. "Just leave him alone," he screamed at the phantom woman. "He's just doing his job." It was deeply unsettling. At the station, he refused to give us his name, just staring at us with those burning eyes. The next morning, 2 men in dark suits arrived. They were US Marshals. Apparently, one of my colleagues had managed to get a name out of our prisoner overnight. He was a wanted fugitive, on the run for years, with a list of charges that included kidnapping, child abuse, and stalking. As the marshals led him out, he stopped and looked right at me. "God told me what to do," he said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "He will tell me to find you again." They took him away, and I never saw him again. But for a long time after that, on foggy, rainy nights, I would find myself looking up at the dark windows of old houses, half expecting to see his face staring back. Some calls etch themselves into your memory not with noise and violence, but with a terrifying, unnerving quiet. This was one of those. It came in around 1 a.m. in the early spring of 2024. The kind of call we label a welfare check. My partner was Marcus, a veteran officer with 20 years on the force, a man whose calm demeanor had a way of grounding the most chaotic scenes. The call was from a man worried about his ex-girlfriend. She had been sending him a series of alarming text messages over the last hour, culminating in, "I wish it wouldn't have ended like this," and "You won't have to worry about me anymore." We drove to a generic 3-story apartment building on the edge of town, the kind of place with beige walls and identical numbered doors where people live their lives in anonymous proximity. We found her apartment on the 2nd floor and knocked. "Police department, ma'am. We need to check on you." The only answer was silence. We knocked again, this time harder, our voices louder and more official. Still nothing. The silence from inside felt heavy, unnatural. Marcus had the dispatcher call the woman's cell phone number, the one provided by the ex-boyfriend. We pressed our ears against the thin wood of the door and heard it. The faint, muffled ringing of a phone from somewhere deep inside the apartment, which then clicked over to voicemail. She was in there. Our posture changed immediately. This was no longer a simple check. It was a potential crisis. We began to pound on the door with our fists. "This is the police. Open the door now, or we will force entry for your safety." We waited a moment, and then we heard a soft fumbling sound from the other side, the distinctive click of a deadbolt being turned. But the door remained shut. I exchanged a look with Marcus. He nodded. I placed my hand on the doorknob, turned it, and slowly pushed the door open. The apartment was pitch black. A wave of warm, humid air washed over us, carrying a strange, coppery smell, like a jar of old pennies. In the sliver of light from the hallway, we saw her, a figure standing stock still in the middle of the dark living room. As our eyes adjusted, the details came into focus, and they were chilling. It was a young woman, completely naked, her skin a ghostly, waxy pale. She was soaking wet, with water dripping from her hair onto the carpet, and she was swaying, a slow, rhythmic back and forth motion like a human metronome. Her arms hung limply at her sides, but her hands were dark, almost black in the dim light. She did not seem to register our presence at all. Her gaze was fixed on a blank patch of wall in front of her. Marcus was on his radio instantly, his voice low and urgent, calling for an ambulance. "Start a rescue. We have a young female, altered mental status, possible self-harm." I took a cautious step into the apartment, trying to get her attention. "Ma'am, my name is Officer Evans. Can you tell me your name?" There was no response, not even a flicker of her eyes. It was then I saw that the dark color on her hands was blood. It was caked on her palms and dripping from her wrists, where a series of shallow but deliberate cuts were visible. While Marcus stayed with the woman, I had to clear the rest of the small apartment. I felt for a light switch by the door and flipped it. Nothing happened. I tried a lamp on an end table. It was dead. The entire apartment was without power, which explained the oppressive heat and darkness. I unholstered my flashlight, its powerful beam cutting a sharp cone through the gloom. The coppery smell was stronger towards the back of the apartment. I checked the bathroom first, pushing the door open. The scene that greeted me stopped me in my tracks. The small, windowless room was aglow with the flickering light of at least 24 tea light candles, arranged on every available surface. The sink, the back of the toilet, the floor, and the walls, covered in cheap white tile, were filled with writing. Words and phrases were scrawled across every surface, even the mirror. In what I realized with a jolt was dark, drying blood. They looked like Bible verses, frantically written. In the center of the room, the bathtub was filled to the brim with dark, murky water, the color of rust. This was where she had been. This was the source of the smell, the humidity. I backed out and went to the bedroom. It was the same scene on a different stage. More candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, and above the unmade bed, more bloody scripture was written on the paint. The bed sheets themselves were stained and soaked. It was a scene of profound mental collapse, a physical manifestation of a mind breaking apart. The paramedics arrived, their presence loud and professional in the eerie quiet of the apartment. We helped them get the woman, who was still catatonic, onto a stretcher and out into the hallway. As they wheeled her away, I stood in the doorway and took one last look inside. The flickering candlelight, the bloody walls, the dark, still water in the tub. It felt like we had stepped through a doorway into someone's private hell. I learned later that she survived. The doctors said she had been sitting in that tub for nearly 4 hours as her blood slowly seeped into the water. I never found out what drove her to that point, and I never asked what the verses on the wall said. Some things you are better off not knowing. The image of her standing there, swaying in the darkness, is one that will stay with me forever. This happened back in 2021. I was 20 years old and living in the same small town in Northern California I had grown up in. My main gig was managing the local community pool, but my real passion was being a volunteer firefighter. I had joined the junior program when I was a teenager, mostly because I loved the competitive running teams, but I stayed for the sense of purpose. I had a real knack for emergency response. That Saturday, I drove about an hour out to a neighboring town for a regional baseball tournament. After our game, I ran into an old friend, Leo. We had played together on a state-level team a few years back and had been inseparable during that time. Life had pulled us in different directions, and we were surprised to find out we were now living only about 50 miles apart. We hadn't seen each other in years. Naturally, we ended up at the local tavern to catch up. The hours flew by as we reminisced over countless beers, laughing about old games and sharing stories about our lives now. Before we knew it, it was midnight, and the bartender was calling for last call. We stumbled out into the cool night air and found that, by sheer coincidence, our trucks were parked near each other. My plan was to drive the 50 miles home on a mostly unpaved but direct road. Leo had a much longer drive, about 100 miles to his family's ranch, which involved taking the bypass around my town and then a long stretch of highway. I wish I could say that one of us had the sense to realize that driving was a terrible idea after so many drinks, but I was about to do the same thing, so I didn't feel like I could say anything. It was a common and stupid mistake people made out there back then, though I would never defend it now. Don't ever do it. We stood there, leaning against the tailgate of his blue Ford pickup, finishing one last beer. I gave him a hard time about his vanity license plate that read, Tricky. It was a nickname he earned from his incredible skill with a bat, his clever plays always catching the other team off guard. We promised to get together again soon, and then we went our separate ways. I managed to avoid any local police on my drive back and got home around 1 in the morning. I took a quick shower and had just gotten into bed when my phone buzzed. It was a missed call from Leo. It had only rung once. I figured maybe he had decided to stop in my town and wanted to continue the party, so I tried calling him back. It rang a few times with no answer, so I gave up and went to sleep. I was jolted awake again around 2:30 by a rapid series of text messages. It was that sound your phone makes when it gets a flood of messages at once. They were all from Leo, but they were complete gibberish, just random strings of letters and symbols. I tried calling him again, multiple times, but there was no answer. I sent him a text telling him he could crash at my place if he was nearby, that I could even get my girlfriend to pick him up. I got no response. At 2:19 in the morning, my fire department pager went off. The alert was for a single vehicle accident on the bypass south of town. The location was vague, but the caller, a telecom worker, was on scene with his van's yellow flashing light. Feeling the effects of the beer, I initially decided not to go. But then, the town's fire siren started blaring repeatedly, and my pager went off again. That meant they didn't have enough crew. I sighed, got dressed, and had my girlfriend drive me the short distance to the station. When I got there, I was the highest-ranking officer present, my station's third in command. There were only 4 other firefighters, making me the 5th. I gathered them and explained that while I had been drinking earlier, I wouldn't have shown up if I wasn't capable of performing my duties. I stated I wouldn't be driving any of the trucks, but I felt competent to be the officer in charge. I told them if anyone had an issue with that, they should speak up, and I would step down. No one said a word. We were a young crew. The most experienced among them had only been on the job for about a year and a half. We set out, with me in the passenger seat of the engine. The trip was supposed to take about 40 minutes. After 20 minutes on the bypass, the cold night air had sobered me up completely. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a simple rollover. Operations hadn't given us any updates, which usually suggested it wasn't a major incident. Then I saw the single flashing yellow light in the distance. As we got closer, the scene told a completely different story. The tire marks on the road were deep and chaotic. It was clear the vehicle had lost control, smashed through a cattle fence, and disappeared into the darkness of a large field. In that field, I could see deep gouges in the earth leading toward a small, walled farm dam. A man in a reflective vest stood on the bank of the dam, waving his flashlight frantically. I jumped out of the truck and assigned tasks to the other 4 firefighters. Then I walked up the muddy bank to meet the man who had called it in. He was panicked, speaking a mile a minute and gesturing wildly with his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, intermittently illuminating an upside-down license plate partially submerged in the water. The truck was on its roof in the dam, with only its rear wheels, exhaust pipe, and the license plate visible. The plate read, "Tricky." As a first responder, you learn to switch into a professional mode. Your training takes over, and you function on autopilot, pushing all emotion aside. You become human again later, when you're alone and the memories come flooding back. But in that moment, standing on the bank of that dam, I became human. I knew that at least 2 hours had passed since the crash, because a layer of frost had already formed over the tire tracks leading into the water. I walked the edge of the dam, desperately searching for any sign that Leo had been thrown from the truck, but I found nothing. My focus returned to the submerged vehicle. I remember my voice cracking as I whispered, "Oh, buddy." A tow truck arrived, and the driver suggested he could just drag the truck out. But I couldn't accept that. I was a lifeguard and a pool manager. I was comfortable in the water. I felt I had to go in and bring my friend out with some dignity. So, at 4 in the morning, with the temperature hovering just above freezing, I stripped down to my boxers and waded into the icy water. I carried a waterproof safety torch, its lanyard tied securely around my waist. I steadied myself with one hand on the truck's chassis, took several deep breaths, and plunged under the surface toward where I thought the driver's door would be. The upside-down orientation of the truck was disorienting, and I struggled to find the door handle. The window was still intact. I surfaced, gasping from the cold, then went down again. This time I found the handle and managed to get the door open, using my legs to brace against the frame and push it wide against the muddy bottom. After another trip to the surface to regulate my breathing, I dove back down. I had to hold the torch against the side of my head just to see a few inches in front of my face as I entered the cab. I will never be able to properly describe the absolute shock and horror of a friend's white, dead face appearing just inches from your own. His eyes were partially open, his jaw broken and twisted. I recoiled violently, smashing my head against the truck's roof. Then, a strange calm washed over me. I felt like it was just a task that needed to be done. In a weird way, I could almost hear Leo teasing me for being so jumpy. I reached over his lifeless arms and began fumbling in the dark for the seatbelt release. He was still strapped in, hanging upside down. I couldn't find it. I went back up for air, my lungs burning, then dove again. I finally located the buckle, but couldn't get it to release. No matter how hard I pushed the button, it was stuck. I was running out of air but refused to surface again, terrified I wouldn't be able to find the buckle in the dark a second time. I was so close. Finally, the buckle clicked open. As I tried to push myself out of the truck to get air, I felt my right wrist snag on something. The lanyard for my torch was caught. I tugged frantically, but it wouldn't break. The torch swung wildly, illuminating random sections of the dashboard and Leo's pale stomach, which only amplified my panic. My lungs were screaming, and I started to feel that involuntary gulping for air that happens when you've held your breath for too long. And then, I just stopped. I stopped struggling. The desperate need for air seemed to vanish. I calmly thought that I just needed to direct the torch toward whatever was snagging my wrist and free myself. When I pointed the light, I saw the lanyard was tangled around the unclasped seatbelt buckle. I tried to work it free, but it was caught tight. A strange warmth spread through my body, and the fear began to return. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. The torch was still moving, and its light passed over Leo's face. But this time, his eyes were wide open, and they were looking directly at me. He had a slight smile on his face. It was as if he was communicating with me, telling me it was okay, that he had my back like always. Then, I watched as his hand moved with purpose, unhooked the lanyard from the buckle, and then simply fell away. I shot to the surface, coughing and sputtering, my lungs aching. When I looked toward the bank, the other firefighters were screaming and pointing. One of them was in the water with me, looking absolutely terrified. After I brought Leo to the bank and he was taken by the ambulance, I tried to piece together what had happened from their perspective. They told me that after I had gone under for the last time, minutes began to pass. They grew increasingly worried. When I explained that my lanyard had gotten stuck, they wouldn't let it go. According to them, I had been underwater for over 15 minutes. After just 1 minute, one of the guys had stripped off his gear and dived in after me. He told me, and still tells me to this day, that he had grabbed my legs and with both of his feet planted on the truck, could not move me. He said he dove down multiple times to see what I was trapped on, but could never find anything holding me. He swore he ran his hands all the way down both of my arms and found nothing. For months after that night, I woke up every single morning at exactly 2:19. It didn't stop until one night I had a dream where Leo appeared and told me it wasn't my fault and that I needed to forgive myself. I have never woken up at 2:19 again. Not a day goes by that I don't miss my friend. I spent a good portion of my life as a paramedic. It's a job that forces you to confront the fragility of life on a daily basis. You see things that most people only see in movies, and you learn to compartmentalize, to build walls around the horror so you can keep functioning. But every once in a while, something happens that breaks through those walls. Something so strange and profound that it stays with you forever. This particular day was a grey, rainy afternoon in late autumn. The kind of relentless, soul-dampening drizzle that makes the road slick and visibility poor. I was driving home after a long shift, feeling the familiar bone-deep weariness that came with the job. The highway was a 2-lane rural route, and the heavy rain had slowed traffic to a crawl. I was the third car in a small line, just trying to get home and put my feet up. We were rounding a long, gentle curve when it happened. A small red sports car coming from the opposite direction suddenly lost control on the wet pavement. I saw it hydroplane, the back end fishtailing wildly. For a split second, it looked like the driver might regain control. But then the car veered sharply, crossed the center line, and slammed head-on into the small SUV that was at the front of our line. The sound was a sickening crunch of metal and glass. My training kicked in instantly. I pulled my car over, my heart pounding, and dialed 911, rattling off the location and the nature of the accident with a practiced calm I didn't feel. As soon as I ended the call, I got out and ran toward the wreckage. There was screaming coming from the SUV, which had been knocked onto the shoulder of the road. In our line of work, screaming is a good sign. It means people are alive and breathing. My first priority was to assess the most critical victims, so I ran past the SUV and down into the ditch where the sports car had come to rest. The scene was devastating. There were 2 young men in the car. The force of the impact had driven the engine block into the passenger compartment. The passenger was still buckled in, his hand gripping the "oh shit" handle above the door. The entire front of the car had been compressed into the back seat area, and the roof had peeled back. The top of the passenger's head was gone. His jawbone was jutting out, raw and jagged. It was an instantaneous, unsurvivable injury. Despite knowing he was gone, I reached in and felt for a pulse, a grim, reflexive action. There was nothing. While I was doing this, I could hear the driver's breathing. It was a ragged, gasping, dragging sound, the sound of someone drowning in their own blood. I moved to the driver's side, but there was nothing I could do for him. The car had literally wrapped itself around him like a metal coffin. It would take an extrication team with heavy equipment to get him out. Listening to his dying breaths, knowing there was absolutely nothing I could do to help, was one of the most helpless feelings I have ever experienced. I spoke to him, my voice low. "I'm so sorry," I said. "Help is on the way. I have to go help the others." In my heart, I knew he wouldn't make it. In triage terms, he was a black tag, a patient whose injuries are so severe they are not expected to survive. I climbed back up to the road and went to the SUV. A family, a mother, a father, and 2 young kids in the back had been inside. They were injured, but alive. I did what I could, stabilizing them, talking to them, keeping them as calm as possible until the first ambulance arrived. The entire family survived, though the mother suffered permanent brain damage. That night, I was home alone, the events of the day replaying in my mind. The image of those 2 young men in the red sports car was burned into my memory. I was getting ready for bed, the only light in the house coming from the small lamp on my nightstand. As I sat on the edge of the bed, I heard a noise in the hallway. It was a soft rhythmic sound, like a thump and then a drag, over and over. It was getting closer. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound stopped right outside my open bedroom door. A hand, broken and curled into an unnatural shape, appeared and gripped the door frame. Then, the boy from the passenger seat was standing there. He looked just as he had in the car, busted up and broken. I was paralyzed, unable to move or scream. He looked at me, his eyes clear and calm despite his horrific appearance. He spoke, his voice not a sound in the air but a thought that appeared directly in my mind. The exact words are hard to recall, but the message was clear. "Hey," he said, "my friend wants you to know he understands. He wants you to know he's okay. We both are. Thanks for trying." He stood there for a few more seconds, just looking at me, and then he stepped back into the shadows of the hallway. I watched his hand let go of the door frame, and I listened as the thumping and dragging sound receded down the hall until it faded into silence. The moment he was gone, the spell was broken. I scrambled to turn on every single light in the house. I slept with the lights on for 2 weeks after that. A few days later, I found the death notices for the 2 boys in the local newspaper and clipped them out. They were both high school seniors, on their way home from a wrestling tournament. I still have those newspaper clippings. It's a tangible reminder of a night that taught me that sometimes the ones we can't save still find a way to say goodbye. I was a rookie. A year on the force in a quiet, aging suburb north of Boston in the winter of 2024. Most of our calls were for things like lost dogs, noise complaints, and the occasional shoplifter at the local strip mall. It was a good place to learn the ropes, a place where the biggest danger was usually boredom. As the newest and smallest officer on the night shift, I was the designated crawler, the one who got sent through unsecured windows or into tight crawl spaces. I did not mind. It was better than sitting in the car, watching the clock tick. I had no idea that my size and my rookie status were about to put me in the path of something that would forever blur the line between the world I thought I knew and a place far older and stranger. The call was a welfare check, a phrase that can mean anything from a lonely old person who has not answered their phone to a gruesome discovery. The initial call was not for me. I heard my field training officer, a grizzled sergeant named Costello, respond to the address. A few minutes of radio silence passed, and then Costello's voice came back, low and frustrated. "Dispatch, have another unit respond to my location. I can't make entry." Another few minutes passed. Another officer arrived. Then Costello's voice again, this time with an edge of real annoyance. "Dispatch, send me the rookie. Miller, tell him to get over here." I arrived at a small, dark, clapboard house at the end of a dead-end street. The house looked like it was sinking into the frozen ground, its porch sagging, its paint peeling in the frigid night air. Costello and the other officer, a guy named Bryce, were standing in the driveway, their breath pluming in the cold. "Doors are locked, windows are painted shut," Costello grunted, his face a mask of frustration. "Neighbors haven't seen Mrs. Gable in 3 days, mail's piling up. But we found this." He led me around to the back of the house and pointed his flashlight at a small bathroom window that was cracked open just a few inches. "You're the skinniest. You're up." The climb was awkward. I had to stand on a wobbly, overturned trash can, and the window was high up. I managed to slide it open the rest of the way and wriggle through, landing with a soft thud on the cold linoleum of a small, dark bathroom. The air in the house was stale, still, and unnaturally cold, colder than it was outside. And there was a smell. It was a faint, sickly sweet odor that I could not quite identify. The smell of something that had gone wrong. From the front of the house, I could hear the low, muffled drone of a television, the familiar, angry cadence of a cable news channel. It was the only sound in the otherwise dead silent house. I drew my flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp, nervous path through the darkness. "Police!" I called out, my voice sounding small and thin in the oppressive quiet. "Mrs. Gable, is anyone home?" And then I heard it. It came from the direction of the television. It was a voice, a woman's voice, old and dry and raspy, like rustling leaves. It was weak, but it was clear. "In here." A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over me. She was alive. She had probably fallen and could not get up. My adrenaline spiked. I was going to be the hero, the rookie who saved the day. I moved quickly out of the bathroom and down a dark, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with old, faded photographs of smiling black and white people, a gallery of ghosts from a life I would never know. The smell was getting stronger, thicker. I reached the living room. The television was on. its blue light casting flickering, dancing shadows on the walls. The room was a cluttered museum of a long life, every surface covered with knickknacks, dusty doilies, and stacks of old magazines. But the room was empty. "Mom," I called out, my voice laced with a new confusion. "Where are you?" There was no answer this time, just the angry, insistent voice from the television. I swept my flashlight beam across the room, and then I saw her. She was not in the living room. She was lying face down on the floor in the arched doorway that led to the dining room, a small, still heap in the shadows. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" I said, rushing to her side. I knelt down and put my hand on her shoulder to gently shake her. The moment my fingers touched her, I knew. She was cold, not just cool to the touch. It was a deep, profound, unnatural cold that seemed to suck the warmth from my own hand. She was rock solid. I carefully rolled her over. Her skin was a waxy, mottled purplish color. Her eyes were half open, clouded over and milky. She had been dead for days. I stood up, my own heart a frantic, panicked bird in my chest. I stumbled backward, my mind a chaotic whirl of disbelief and terror. I heard her. I did not imagine it. I heard her voice. It was as real as the television, as real as the cold floor beneath my feet. My mind was scrambling for a rational explanation. The TV? A neighbor? But the voice had been in the room. It had been a response to my own. I walked to the front door on legs that felt like they were made of wood and unlocked it, letting Costello and Bryce in. "She's in the dining room," I said, my voice a shaky, unfamiliar thing. "She's gone. Been gone for a while." Costello walked past me, his face grim and professional. I grabbed his arm. "Sarge," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "When I came in, I heard her. I swear to God, I heard her call out to me." Costello stopped and looked at me, his eyes searching my face. I expected him to laugh, to tell me I was a stupid, spooked rookie. But he did not. He just held my gaze for a long, silent moment. "Okay, Miller," he said, his voice quiet. "Let's clear the house." We did a full, thorough, top-to-bottom search of that small, cold house. We checked every closet, the dusty, spiderweb-filled attic, the damp, musty basement. There was no one, just us and the body of Mrs. Gable and the endless, angry chatter of the television. I have been a cop for a few years now. I have seen things that have shaken me, things that have made me angry, things that have made me sad. But that call is the only one that has ever truly, profoundly scared me. I am a man who deals in facts, in evidence, in the cold, hard, logical reality of the world. But I cannot logically explain what happened in that house. I know what I saw. A woman who had been dead for at least 3 days. And I know what I heard. The sound of her voice, calling out for help from a place that no one should be able to call from. It was a ghost in the machine, a final, desperate echo from a life that had already ended. A voice that has been whispering in the back of my own mind ever since. People often ask me what the worst thing I have ever seen on the job is. They expect a single dramatic story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. The truth is, it is not one thing. It is a collection of moments, of images and smells and sounds that accumulate over the years until they become a part of you. My career in law enforcement, which took me from the swampy backroads of Louisiana to the hard streets of Chicago, was filled with such moments. 3 calls, in particular, stand out in my memory, not because of their gore, but because of the sheer coldness of the human behavior behind them. The first was early in my career, back in 2015. I was part of a narcotics team, serving a warrant on a rundown trailer park a few miles outside of Baton Rouge. The target was a man wanted for large-scale meth distribution. We had received a tip that he was holed up in a specific trailer, one that was supposedly abandoned after the previous owner drank himself to death. We did our briefing in the pre-dawn darkness, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. We approached the trailer in full tactical gear, a line of dark figures moving through the tall, wet grass. My job was to be the second man through the door after the breacher. When the door splintered inward, the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was a chemical cocktail of gasoline, marijuana, and something else, something foul and stagnant. The inside of the trailer was a disaster. It looked like a drug warehouse had exploded. There were bales of marijuana stacked almost to the ceiling, bags of cocaine and meth scattered across every surface, and a chunk of crack cocaine the size of a bowling ball sitting on a dirty countertop. It was easily hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of narcotics, but it was the smell of gasoline that put us all on high alert. It was overpowering. My team leader immediately recognized the danger. This was not just a stash house, it was a bomb waiting to go off. The dealers were ready to torch the evidence at a moment's notice. He gave the order to pull back. "Everybody out now!" he yelled. We backed out carefully, our eyes scanning the dark woods around the trailer park, expecting an ambush. We set up a perimeter and waited for the scene to be secured. We were standing there, catching our breath in the humid air when we saw it. A small flicker of light in the distance, moving quickly through the trees. It was a trail of fire racing along a line of gasoline that had been poured on the ground. It snaked its way towards the trailer, and in an instant, the entire structure was engulfed in a massive fireball. The heat was so intense it pushed us back. We grabbed the small fire extinguishers from our vehicles, but it was like trying to put out a volcano with a garden hose. We managed to save a few bags of cocaine and meth that were thrown clear by the explosion, but the rest was gone. The target was not in the trailer. A few days later, his body was found floating in a nearby swamp. The case went cold. We never found out who lit the fire, but it was a chilling lesson in the ruthlessness of the drug trade. They were willing to burn a fortune just to keep us from getting it. A few years later, I had transferred to Chicago. The work there was different. It was faster, more violent, and far more personal. The call that sticks with me the most from that time came on a cold afternoon in 2019. It was a mugging, a common enough occurrence in the district I worked, but this one was different. The victim was a little boy, just 8 years old. He had been walking home from a friend's house, proudly wearing a new pair of Air Jordan sneakers he had gotten for his birthday. According to the witnesses, a man approached him and demanded the shoes. The little boy, full of the innocent courage that only an 8-year-old can have, refused. They were his birthday present, and he was not giving them up. The man, who was described as being of average height with braided hair, did not just take the shoes. He beat the boy to death right there on the sidewalk, took the Jordans, and walked away. I was one of the first officers on the scene. I will never forget the sight of that small body, lying on the cold concrete. The investigation was frustrating. The description of the attacker could have fit thousands of men in the city. There was no DNA, no clear fingerprints. For weeks, the case went nowhere, and I carried the image of that boy with me every day. About a month later, we got a break. A man matching the description was arrested during a home invasion. In his possession were several stolen items, including a pair of boys' Air Jordans. When we brought him in for questioning, he eventually confessed to the murder. He was sentenced to 47 years to life. There was a sense of justice, of course, but it felt hollow. A little boy was dead over a pair of shoes. It was a level of senseless cruelty that I still cannot comprehend. The final memory comes from a call in the Kensington area of the city, a place notorious for its open-air drug markets and violence. We got a call about a foul odor coming from an apartment above a tattoo parlor. We forced entry and found a woman, maybe in her late 20s, dead under a sleeping bag. Her name was Amanda O'Donnell. She had been stabbed multiple times. The scene was gruesome, with blood soaked into the carpet and splattered on the walls. As we processed the scene, I learned more about her. She was a runaway from a small town in Ohio, and like so many others, she had been drawn into the world of addiction that thrived in Kensington. She had a family that missed her, a mother who was still hoping she would come home. Looking at her, lying there in that filthy room, I did not just see a victim of a homicide. I saw the end result of a long, sad story. Her killer was never found. These three events, a burned-out trailer in Louisiana, a murdered child on a Chicago sidewalk, and a forgotten woman in a rundown apartment, are not just stories to me. They are scars. They serve as a constant reminder of the darkness that people are capable of, and of the ghosts that every officer carries with them long after they take off the uniform. I'm a police officer in a quiet suburban town. Most of my days are filled with traffic stops, domestic disputes, and the occasional burglary. It's a job that can be monotonous, but you learn to appreciate the quiet, because when it's broken, it's usually shattered into a million pieces. This call came in on a sunny Tuesday afternoon, a day that felt too bright and cheerful for the darkness that was about to unfold. The call was for a disturbance at a local hospice facility, a calm, quiet place where people went to live out their final days with dignity. The administrator met me at the front entrance, her face pale and worried. She told me about a woman named Jenna, a contracted nurse who worked there part-time. Jenna had shown up that morning on her day off, with her 3-year-old son in tow. Her behavior had been bizarre from the moment she walked in. She had approached an elderly patient, a retired police captain named Joe, and insisted he was her grandfather. She placed her son in the old man's lap and tried to wheel him out of the facility, screaming that the staff was holding him hostage. The thing was, Joe wasn't related to her at all. He didn't even know her. When the staff intervened, Jenna became agitated, tried to steal medication from a nurse's cart, and scratched another nurse who got in her way. The administrator stressed that just the day before, Jenna had been her normal, cheerful self. She had no history of mental illness, no drug use, nothing that would explain this sudden, terrifying shift in personality. It was, the administrator said, like she had been replaced by an identical copy who was dangerously unhinged. I found Jenna sitting in the lobby, her son playing happily at her feet. When I spoke to her, she was perfectly calm and lucid. She answered all my questions, gave me her information, and didn't cause any trouble. But there was something profoundly wrong. She spoke about her grandfather, Joe, with a detailed, loving history that was entirely fictional. Her eyes seemed to look right through me, and there was a strange, flat quality to her voice, even when she smiled. The facility was reluctant to press charges, and Joe, the retired cop, just felt sorry for her. My only recourse was an emergency custody order for a psychiatric evaluation, but I didn't have enough to justify it. We called her family, and her father arrived a short time later. He was a kind-looking man, his face etched with confusion and worry. He explained that Jenna was a wonderful mother, that she had a happy life, and that this was completely out of character. He went to talk to her, and I watched as his expression shifted from concern to bewilderment, and then to a quiet horror. He pulled me aside a few minutes later, his voice barely a whisper. "Officer," he said, his eyes pleading with me to understand. "I can tell you that woman looks like my daughter, but that is not my daughter. The way she looks at me, there's nothing behind her eyes." As he said this, I heard the click of a car door opening, followed by the solid thud of the locks engaging. My stomach dropped. It was that sixth sense you develop as a cop, an internal alarm that screams when a situation is about to go horribly wrong. I turned to see that Jenna was in her car, her little boy bouncing in her arms in the passenger seat. I knocked on the window, trying to keep my voice calm and friendly. "Jenna, can we talk some more?" She refused, a placid smile on her face. I asked if her father could hold the baby for a minute. "That's not my father," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. My supervisor had arrived by then, and he started trying to talk to her through the driver's side window, while I stayed on the passenger side, my hand resting on the door handle, my mind racing. We had no legal cause to break in, but every instinct was telling me that the child was in grave danger. Then, Jenna's smile vanished. "You're just trying to take away my baby," she said, her voice turning cold and hard. She pulled the little boy tightly against her chest, pressing his face into her shoulder. The baby's happy laughter stopped. I saw his little hand jerk and then go limp. He wasn't breathing. Adrenaline surged through me. It took 3 powerful swings of my baton to shatter the tempered glass of the window. My supervisor was screaming at me to get the child. I scrambled through the broken glass, my arms getting sliced up, and reached across the seat. I hooked my fingers under the baby's chin and pulled his head away from her chest. He let out a choked, bloody wail, and in that moment, Jenna looked right at me. The driver's side door opened as my supervisor got it unlocked, and she just smiled, a chilling, vacant smile. "You're trying to take my baby, you white devil," she hissed. It happened in an instant. Her teeth bared, and she lunged forward, biting down on her son's ear. I heard the baby's scream of pure, unadulterated pain. I reacted without thinking, wrapping my arms around her head, my fingers digging into her jaw, and pulled, forcing her head back. She went limp, the fight suddenly gone from her. Her father, who had been watching in horror, took the baby and rushed him inside. The boy lived, but they never found his ear. I saw her later in court. All criminal charges were dismissed, and she was committed to a mental institution for life. She sat there in the courtroom, a hollowed-out shell of a person. All the life was gone from her eyes. It was like the lights were on, but no one was home. I still can't explain how a healthy, vibrant young woman could go from 0 to insane in a matter of hours. It wasn't a monster or a ghost that did that. It was something inside her own mind that broke. And that, to me, is more terrifying than any ghost story I've ever heard. In the city where I work, there's a place that most people don't know exists. It's not on any public maps, and you would never stumble upon it by accident. We call it the terminal yard. It's an impound lot, but it's not for illegally parked cars or DUIs. This is where vehicles go when they are part of a fatal incident. It's a massive, secure warehouse in a forgotten industrial part of town, surrounded by a 15-foot fence topped with razor wire. It is a library of tragic endings, a place where the twisted metal husks of cars wait to be processed, their stories soaked into the upholstery and embedded in the shattered glass. And it is, by every account of those who have to spend time there, deeply haunted. I first heard the stories from Sarah, one of our forensic technicians. She was a no-nonsense, scientifically minded woman who believed in evidence, not ghost stories. I had to drop off a vehicle from a crash scene one night, and I found her outside the main office, chain-smoking in the cold, her face pale under the harsh yellow security lights. She looked rattled. I asked her if she was okay, and the story just spilled out of her. She had been working late, processing a sedan from a horrific head-on collision on the interstate. The driver had been killed instantly. Her job was to photograph and document the interior of the vehicle. She was leaning through the driver's side window, taking pictures of the dashboard. She looked through her camera's viewfinder to frame a shot of the passenger seat and froze. There was a man sitting there. He was just looking at her. She told me he looked completely ordinary, maybe in his 40s, wearing a plain button-down shirt. But his eyes, she said, were empty, like 2 dark holes. Her first thought was that a vagrant had somehow gotten into the secure yard and climbed into the car. She slowly lowered her camera, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was still there, not a photograph, but a solid presence in the seat next to her. He didn't move or speak. He just stared. She let out a choked scream, scrambled backwards, and ran to the office to get Frank, the night manager. Frank, a guy who had worked there for 30 years, grabbed a heavy flashlight and went back with her. The car was empty. They searched the entire warehouse, a massive, locked-down building with only one way in or out. There was no one. Sarah refused to go back to the yard alone after that. Her story spooked me, and I started talking to Frank every time a call took me out to the terminal yard. Frank had seen it all and had a collection of his own stories. One night, he called me into his office and pointed at a grainy black and white security monitor. "Watch this," he said, and rewound the footage from the night before. I saw myself on the screen, walking through the main warehouse after dropping off some evidence. As I walked between two rows of wrecked cars, a bright point of light appeared on the screen. It was not a dust mote or an insect. It moved with incredible speed, zipping around my body, circling my head, and then shooting off into the darkness of the warehouse. I tried to explain it away, but Frank just shook his head. "See them all the time," he said. "They're curious." He told me about the attic above the office. It was a dusty, forgotten space, crammed with old files and broken equipment. A few months prior, the personal effects from a family of 4 who had perished in a house fire had to be stored in the office temporarily. Their smoke-damaged clothes were in evidence bags, stacked right beneath the square hatch that led to the attic. In the middle of the night, an alarm went off. Frank, who lived in a small apartment on the property, came to investigate. The office was secure, but he saw a faint light seeping from the cracks around the attic hatch. He got a ladder and cautiously poked his head into the space. A single, bare light bulb, caked with decades of dust and grime, was glowing dimly. He knew for a fact that the bulb had been burned out for years, and the wiring to it was frayed and disconnected. As he watched, it flickered and died, plunging the attic back into darkness. It has never come on again. The most common occurrences were the motion detectors. One night, I was in the office with Frank, finishing up some paperwork, when an alarm blared through the building. The monitor showed it was from Warehouse C, one of the larger storage bays. We went to check it out. The massive rolling door was sealed, the pedestrian door locked tight. We went inside, and the air was still and cold. There were no open windows, no drafts, no rats scurrying around. The motion sensor that had been tripped was mounted on a steel beam, aimed directly at a wrecked minivan. I remembered that vehicle. A mother and her 2 children had died in it the previous winter when they slid off an icy bridge. Frank just sighed and reset the alarm. "It's them," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "That one goes off a few times a week, always points at the van." I had my own experience there, one that I have never been able to rationalize. I had to go back late one night to retrieve an item from a vehicle that had already been processed. Frank had gone home, and I was alone in the vast, echoing space. The only sounds were the dripping of residual fluids from the wrecks and the low hum of the overhead lights. As I walked deeper into the warehouse, I heard something. It was music, very faint, like a car radio playing from a long way off. It was an old, tinny-sounding song I didn't recognize. I followed the sound, my boots crunching on bits of broken glass. It led me to a blue sedan, its entire passenger side crushed inwards like an aluminum can. The battery was disconnected. The dashboard was a mess of shattered plastic and wires. The music was clearly coming from inside. I leaned closer, my ear near the broken window, and the music stopped, just cut out into total silence. And in that silence, as my breath fogged the cold glass, a perfect small handprint appeared on the inside of the window, as if a child had just pressed their palm against it from the other side. I did not finish my task that night. I walked out, locked the door behind me, and never went back to the terminal yard alone again. Some places just hold on to the pain, and that yard was overflowing with it. The county jail is a world of its own, a concrete and steel ecosystem that operates on a different rhythm from the outside world. I worked there as a detention officer for 5 years, starting back in 2021. You learn the sounds of the place, the metallic clang of a closing cell door, the distant, echoing shouts of the inmates, the monotonous squeak of your own rubber-soled shoes on the polished concrete floors. You learn the smells, the sharp, chemical tang of industrial cleaner, the stale odor of unwashed bodies, the faint, ever-present scent of despair. And you learn to build a wall, a thick, internal barrier to protect yourself from the tide of human misery that you wade through on every shift. My post was the medical solitary unit, a place for inmates who were either too sick, too mentally unstable, or too much of a danger to themselves to be in the general population. It was the deepest, quietest circle of our particular hell. My days were a monotonous routine of passing out medications, monitoring inmates on suicide watch, and breaking up the occasional fight. You learn to develop a rapport with the regulars, a kind of professional, detached intimacy. You know their stories, their triggers, their demons. Mark was one of my regulars. He was a young guy, maybe in his mid-20s, in for a string of petty drug charges. He was not a bad kid, just a lost one, caught in the revolving door of addiction and incarceration. We had a good rapport. I knew he had a girlfriend on the outside who he talked about like she was the second coming. She was his reason for getting clean, his one hope for a different kind of life. A week before the incident, she broke up with him in a letter. I watched him fall apart. The light in his eyes went out. He stopped eating. He stopped talking. He would just sit on the edge of his bunk in his small windowless cell, staring at the wall for hours. We put him on suicide watch, which in our facility meant a single-bladed shaving razor in the morning, which he had to return immediately after use, and checks every 15 minutes. It was a flawed system, but it was the one we had. The morning it happened started like any other. I was at my desk at the end of the cell block, finishing up my paperwork from the morning razor pass. The control room radioed me, the voice of the officer in the bubble calm and routine. "Officer Miller, the inmates in Medsol are calling for you. Someone cut themselves." I did not think much of it. Self-harm was a common currency in the unit. It was usually a superficial scratch, a desperate cry for attention. I grabbed a single Band-Aid and a pair of latex gloves and started the long walk back down the cell block. The other inmates were banging on their cell doors as I walked past, their voices a chaotic chorus of shouts. "It's Mark. He's losing it. You gotta help him." The urgency in their voices, the genuine fear, was the first sign that this was not a routine call. Mark was in cell number 10, at the very end of the block. The cell doors were not solid steel. They were thick bars, close enough together that you could not fit through, but far enough apart that you could easily pass an arm through. As I approached, I could hear him. He was chanting a low, rhythmic, and deeply disturbed mantra. "Gotta get this bitch's name off my neck. Gotta cut this bitch's name off my neck." I got to his cell. He was standing with his back to me, facing the small, polished steel mirror above his sink. In his right hand, he was holding the single silver blade from the razor he had broken open. "Mark," I said, my voice calm and steady, the voice I had been trained to use. "It's Miller. Let's talk, buddy. What's going on?" He did not seem to hear me. He just kept chanting, his eyes fixed on his own reflection. I tried again, louder this time. "Mark, turn around and talk to me." This time, it worked. He stopped chanting. He turned around slowly, the razor blade held tightly in his hand. His eyes met mine, and for a split second, I saw the lost kid I knew. And then he was gone, replaced by a stranger, his eyes a flat, dead, soulless black. He looked right at me, and with a single, smooth, unbelievably fast motion, he brought the blade up to the left side of his neck, just below his ear, and sliced. He did not hesitate. He did not flinch. He just drew the blade across his entire throat, from his ear to the center of his windpipe, a deep, clean, horrific line. And as he did it, he spoke the words of his chant one last time, his voice a gurgling, wet whisper. "Gotta get this name off my neck." He had nicked his carotid artery. The world exploded in a spray of hot crimson blood. It hit me across the face and chest, a warm, shocking wave that smelled of iron and salt. My brain simply could not process what it had just seen. I was frozen for a long, terrible second, staring at him as the arterial spray painted the walls of his small cell in a ghastly, pulsing rhythm. My training kicked in with the force of a physical blow. I was on my radio, my voice a strangled shout, calling for backup, for an ambulance, for a suicide attempt. Mark had collapsed to the floor of his cell, and the blood was pooling around him, a dark, spreading tide. My backup arrived, and we had to wrestle the key from the control officer, who was frozen in shock. We got the cell door open, and the next few minutes were a blur of controlled, bloody chaos. We had to fight Mark, who was still trying to resist, to finish the job. We got the blade away from him, and I pressed a wad of gauze against his neck, my hands sinking into the warm, gaping wound, trying to staunch the impossible flow of blood. He survived. I do not know how, but he did. He came back to the jail a few weeks later, a thick, ugly scar, a permanent, smiling red line across his throat. He tried it again, twice more, with less success. The second time, he tried to hang himself with a bedsheet. The third time, he reopened the scar with a sharpened plastic spoon. About a month after the first incident, things had quieted down. Mark was on a new cocktail of medications that seemed to be working. He was calm, lucid, the lost kid I knew again. One afternoon, he called me over to his new cell. "Miller," he said, his voice quiet, "I need to talk to you." I was wary, but I went over. "I just wanted to apologize," he said, his eyes on the floor, "for getting blood on you, and I wanted to thank you for saving my life." I did not know what to say. I just nodded. "But there's something else you need to know," he said, and he finally looked up at me, his eyes filled with a genuine, terrible shame. "On a personal level, man to man, I have hepatitis C. I was really worried I had ruined your life after you saved mine." A wave of ice-cold dread washed over me, a retroactive fear that was more profound than the shock I had felt in the moment. I had been tested, of course. It was standard procedure. I was clean. But in that moment, standing there, listening to his quiet, ashamed confession, I realized the true cost of the job. It is not just the violence, the horror, the things you see. It is the things you take home with you, unknowingly, in your blood, in your mind. It is the quiet, invisible wounds that never fully heal. In the summer of 2010, I was 24 years old, and my world was a symphony of sirens. I was a freelance crime reporter in New York City, a job title that sounds much more glamorous than it is. The reality was a nocturnal existence, fueled by cheap coffee and the constant crackling voice of a police scanner. I lived in a small, roach-infested apartment in Queens, and my life was a frantic, adrenaline-soaked chase from one tragedy to the next, hoping to capture a few seconds of usable footage that I could sell to one of the local news stations. You learn to be callous. You have to. If you let every story get to you, the city will eat you alive. My unofficial partner in this ghoulish enterprise was a man named Sal, a veteran newspaper photographer who had been covering the city's dark underbelly since before I was born. Sal was a stooped, cynical man with a perpetually dripping nose and a camera that looked like it had been through a war. He taught me the unwritten rules of the trade, how to read a crime scene, how to talk to cops, and most importantly, how to build the wall in your head that keeps the horror on the other side. My first night out with Sal was my baptism by fire. The call came over the scanner just after 2 a.m. A jumper in a residential neighborhood in the Bronx. We arrived to a scene bathed in the cold, strobing light of a dozen emergency vehicles. A 30-story apartment building loomed over a small, darkened playground. The body was near the swing set. He had landed head first. The scene was a mess, a grotesque, abstract painting of human ruin on the dark asphalt. I was a whirlwind of pure adrenaline, my camera a shield between me and the reality of what I was looking at. Sal, on the other hand, was a picture of calm, methodical professionalism. He took a few wide shots, then wandered off to talk to a detective he knew. He came back 20 minutes later, his expression unchanged. "Left a note," he said, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. Depressed about losing custody of his kids. He was just a waiter. Nobody important. The casual, brutal finality of his assessment, the reduction of a man's entire tragic story to a single dismissive sentence, was my first lesson in the necessary cruelty of the job. The stories started to blur together, a montage of the city's endless capacity for suffering. There was the subway suicide at the Times Square station. We did not see the body, just the aftermath. The grim-faced transit workers, the hushed, efficient movements of the medical examiner's team. The body was brought up from the tracks in 3 separate, heavy black bags. As they loaded the bags into the back of a sterile white van, a train on the opposite platform pulled into the station. Its doors opening with a cheerful chime, disgorging a crowd of laughing, chattering tourists into the station, their worlds completely untouched by the horrific event that had just unfolded a few feet beneath their feet. Then there was the woman in the apartment fire. The call was in a tenement building in the Lower East Side. The fire was out by the time we got there, but the air in the hallway was thick with the acrid, greasy smell of something that had burned that should not have. They wheeled her out on a gurney. She was alive, but just barely. Her entire upper torso was a ruin of charred, blackened flesh. Sal, in a moment of uncharacteristic, grim poetry, muttered that she looked like a piece of overcooked barbecue chicken. But it was the sound she made that got to me. It was not a scream. It was a low, constant, rattling struggle for breath, a wet, desperate sound that was the auditory equivalent of her ruined body. It was the sound of a person drowning on the inside. That sound slipped past the wall I was trying so hard to build. But in the midst of all the darkness, there was the thrill of the chase, the competitive, addictive rush of getting the story. Our win, as Sal called it, came on a hot, sticky August night. The scanner lit up with a call for a shooting outside a barbershop in Harlem. We got there, and the street was a chaotic sea of uniforms and flashing lights. We did our job, getting the usual shots. Shell casings glinting on the pavement under the streetlights, emergency vehicles, the grim, tired faces of the detectives. We were about to pack it in when a man, a local resident who had been watching from his stoop, came up to us. "Hey," he said, his voice a low conspiratorial whisper. "You see that over there?" He pointed to a dark, wet-looking splotch on the sidewalk, a few feet away from the main cluster of police activity. "I think that's blood." I called over a young patrolman and pointed it out. He gave me a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. "It's ketchup, you idiot," he sneered, and turned his back on me. But Sal had seen it too. He looked at me, a rare, wolfish grin on his face. "Come on, kid," he said. "Let's take a walk." We followed the splotch. It led us away from the main crime scene, down the block, and as we followed it, it got larger. The splotches became drips, and the drips became a clear, distinct trail, punctuated by the unmistakable boot print of a work shoe. The trail led us to the entrance of a multi-story tenement building. The air in the lobby was thick and still. The floor of the elevator was covered in a smeared, sticky layer of blood. The elevator itself was out of order. "Well, hell," Sal muttered, and we started up the stairs. By the time we hit the 3rd floor, the smell was overwhelming. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse, the coppery, metallic tang of fresh blood. The blood trail led us down a long, dimly lit hallway to a single apartment door. Outside the door was a scene of frantic, desperate first aid. A blood-soaked towel, a single, discarded work boot, and a pool of blood so large it was starting to seep under the door. We had just raised our cameras to get the shot when we heard footsteps pounding up the stairs behind us. A patrolman came jogging down the hall towards us, his face a mask of angry surprise. "Get out of here! This is a crime scene!" he yelled. It was too late. We had our shots. We had beaten the NYPD to the second half of their own crime scene. We found out the story later. The victim had been shot in the leg during a botched robbery. Not wanting to wait around for the shooter to come back and finish the job, he had dragged himself home to a family member's apartment, had wrapped the wound, and had called his own ambulance. He was laid up in the hospital, but he was going to be fine. On the drive back to Queens, the adrenaline was coursing through me. We had done it. We had out-hustled the cops, followed our instincts, and gotten a story that no one else had. It was a victory. But as I looked out the window at the sleeping city, the image of the burned woman, the sound of her ragged, rattling breaths came back to me, unbidden. Our win, our great journalistic coup, was still just another story built on a foundation of someone else's pain and terror. I quit the job less than a year later. I had learned how to be callous. I just could not live with the cost. I used to be a volunteer first responder in the small, quiet town where I grew up. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, which made it a great place to live, but a difficult place to work in emergency services. One early morning, our pagers went off for a single car accident on a notoriously dangerous stretch of road. It was a main route that cut through a heavily wooded area, full of blind curves and sudden dips. People who didn't know the road often drove way too fast on it. When we got the call, I immediately pictured the usual scenario: a driver taking a turn too fast, losing control, and ending up in a ditch. But what I saw when we arrived was something else entirely. The car was so mangled it was almost unrecognizable as a vehicle. It looked like it had been put through an industrial shredder. Glass was scattered across the pavement like glitter, and a rainbow sheen of oil and coolant spread out in a wide circle. We passed a tree with a huge gash in its bark as we pulled up, and I could see where the car had first made impact. But the wreck itself was another 20 yards down the road, upside down in the opposite lane, facing the wrong direction. The physics of it made no sense. It seemed the driver had hit the tree on a curve, but instead of stopping, the car had continued to tumble and roll down the road. The rescue truck was already on the scene, and the crew was working with the jaws of life to pry open the wreckage. Paramedics were standing by with a stretcher, but it was clear the victim would need to be airlifted. Another firefighter and I were tasked with setting up a landing zone in a small, conveniently located field nearby. We laid out the markers for the helicopter, which arrived within minutes. The pilot was hesitant to land because the clearing was so small, surrounded by tall trees. While my lieutenant coordinated with the flight crew, another firefighter, Chloe, waved me over to help with the victim. When I got to the car, I saw him. The driver had no face. It was a mess of blood, swollen tissue, and missing chunks of skin. His arm and leg were bent at unnatural angles. It was one of the most gruesome things I had ever seen. I noticed Chloe was acting strangely. She kept cycling through a series of emotions. She would look upset and confused, on the verge of tears, then her expression would harden with a look of angry determination. I wanted to ask her what was wrong, but it didn't seem appropriate while we were trying to save someone's life. As it turned out, Chloe had recognized the car as soon as she arrived on the scene, but she couldn't recognize the person inside. She had been one of the first to arrive and was leading the effort to get him out. The thought that she might know the victim hadn't even crossed her mind until they started freeing him from the mangled steel. Once he was out of the car and on the stretcher, the paramedics began to clean the blood from his face to assess his injuries. As his features became clearer, I watched Chloe's expression change. Her professional, determined look slowly melted away, replaced by a mask of pure horror and anguish. Her face contorted as if she had just tasted something sour, and it looked like she was fighting to hold back a flood of tears and a scream. Then, just as quickly, she forced herself back into work mode. By the time the helicopter landed, we had the victim strapped to a backboard and ready to go. We all worked together to carry him up the small, steep slope to the field where the helicopter was waiting. He was loaded in, and the helicopter took off, its rotor wash whipping through the trees. The moment it was gone, Chloe collapsed. Her legs just gave out from under her, and she fell to the ground, letting out a heart-wrenching sob. Another firefighter, who seemed to understand what was happening, sat down beside her and put an arm around her, but it did little to comfort her. She wailed, talking to herself between sobs, saying things like, "Why did it have to be him?" and "What an idiot," and then blaming herself. Later that week, we had a mandatory debriefing to review the incident. We discussed the cause of the accident, the status of the victim, and our team's performance. That's when we learned why Chloe had been so devastated. She stood up in front of everyone and told us that the victim, Ethan, was a close friend of hers from high school. She explained that when she first got to the scene, she didn't even consider that it could be someone she knew. She had told herself to stay calm and focus on the job, but as they pulled him from the car and the paramedics cleaned him up, she recognized him. She said she had been holding her breath the entire time, fighting the urge to break down. Only when the helicopter was gone could she finally let it all out. The most devastating part for her was knowing he probably wouldn't survive. She also felt an immense weight of responsibility, knowing she was directly involved in trying to save his life, and she admitted she would blame herself if he died. The final report determined that Ethan had been taking the turn way too fast. He had slid sideways, and the back of his car had slammed into the tree. This sent the car spinning down the road, where it hit a slight incline on the shoulder of the road, just steep enough to cause it to roll over multiple times. The investigators estimated his speed was over 80 miles per hour, which was unbelievably fast for that road. Hearing that, I was surprised the car hadn't just launched into the woods. It suddenly made the catastrophic damage to the vehicle make sense. Our crew's performance review was positive. We had handled everything by the book. We secured the scene, extricated the victim efficiently, and cleared the road. We had done everything as correctly as we could have. But Ethan passed away at the hospital a few days later. He was 21, the same age as Chloe. That was the worst single car accident I have ever witnessed, and it was also one of the first major calls I ever responded to as a firefighter. Before that, most of our calls were for minor things like burnt toast setting off a fire alarm at the nursing home. The experience taught me a hard lesson about the realities of the job. Please, drive safely. It is far better to be a minute late to where you are going than for your family to have to observe a minute of silence for the rest of their lives. I'd only been on the force for about 2 years, still fresh enough that the job hadn't completely hardened me yet. I was working the night shift in a bustling college town, a shift that was usually a predictable mix of noise complaints, bar fights, and DUIs. But on this particular night in late September, the city was quiet, shrouded in a cold, relentless rain that turned the streets into black mirrors. The monotony was broken just after midnight by a call of shots fired. In a college town, that could mean anything from actual gunfire to a car backfiring to, most likely, some drunk students setting off fireworks. Unless we get multiple calls confirming it, we usually just send one unit to check it out. That night, that unit was me. The reported location was near the university's massive football stadium. It was the middle of the season, so the sprawling parking lots surrounding the stadium were dotted with huge white tents for the weekend tailgaters. The place was deserted now, and the rows of empty tents looked eerie in the rain, like a ghostly carnival. I drove slowly through the lots, my spotlights sweeping back and forth, cutting through the downpour. About halfway through my patrol of the lot, my light caught something. The silhouette of a man sitting in a folding chair under one of the tents. He was sitting with his back to me, hunched forward as if he were resting his elbows on his knees, deep in thought. I pulled my patrol car closer, lighting him up, and notified dispatch that I was out with one person. I got out of my car, the rain immediately soaking my uniform, and started walking toward him. "Hey man, you okay?" I called out, my voice sounding small against the drumming of the rain on the tent's vinyl roof. "Did you hear anything strange tonight? Police department, I need you to talk to me." He didn't move. He didn't even flinch. As I got closer, my flashlight beam fell on the pavement next to his chair. I saw the unmistakable outline of a shotgun. My training kicked in instantly. The nature of the call, the unresponsive subject, the presence of a weapon. It was enough for me to unholster my pistol and order dispatch to hold the channel. I kept calling out to him as I approached, my heart pounding in my chest. "Sir, I need to see your hands. Show me your hands." I closed the distance, my handgun held low and ready. 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet. I moved to the side to come around to his front. I was 6 feet away, under the relative shelter of the tent with him, my weapon's tactical light now fully illuminating the scene. Shotgun suicides are a messy, violent affair. This one had been brutally effective. He had blown his head clean off. For a moment, the clinical detached part of my brain took over, the part that you train to observe and report. I noted the strange, peaceful-looking posture he was in. His elbows were indeed resting on his knees, his hands dangling between them. It was as if, in the split second after he had pulled the trigger, he had carefully set the shotgun down beside him and then leaned forward to ponder what he had just done. It was about that time that I realized that even though I was under the tent, I could still feel the rain. A cold drop hit my cheek. I instinctively wiped it away, confused. Another drop landed on the back of my hand. I looked down. It wasn't clear like a raindrop. It was dark, thick, and red. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I tilted my head back and pointed my flashlight up. The inside of the white tent roof was a grotesque work of abstract art. It was coated in a fine pink mist, a horrific spray of blood and tissue. It was a Jackson Pollock painting from hell. From this gruesome canvas, heavier droplets of blood were condensing and dripping down, mimicking the sound and feel of the rain outside. I had been standing in a shower of the dead man's remains. I stumbled back out into the real rain, gasping, trying not to vomit. The professional wall I had built around myself crumbled into dust. In that moment, I wasn't an officer. I was just a 22-year-old kid who had just seen something that no amount of training could ever prepare you for. Eventually, other officers arrived, then the detectives, then the coroner. The scene became a whirl of procedural activity, but I was stuck in that moment under the tent. The image of that dripping red canopy is burned into my mind forever. To this day, years later, whenever I'm caught in a heavy rain, I can still feel the phantom sensation of those cold, thick drops on my skin, and my hair stands on end. I used to be a paramedic in central Connecticut, a place that's a strange mix of suburban sprawl and dense rural woods. For the most part, our calls were what you'd expect: medical emergencies, car accidents, the usual rhythm of life and death in a mid-sized city. My partner Ron and I had been working together for about 3 years at that point. He was a good guy, steady and reliable, a mountain of a man who rarely got rattled. We had a comfortable routine, a shared understanding that came from spending countless hours together in the front cab of an ambulance. I never thought our job would lead us to something that felt like it was torn from the pages of a forgotten folklore book. It was a chilly autumn night in 2010, around 4:30 in the morning. We had been dispatched to the very edge of our coverage area, a part of the state people called the Quiet Corner, for a reason. It was sparsely populated, heavily forested, and felt a world away from the city. Just as we were getting close, the call was cancelled. A closer unit had taken it. It was a long drive back, and we were both tired, looking forward to the end of a long shift. To shave off some time, we took a shortcut. Ron turned off the main state route and onto a side street that eventually led to Pumpkin Hill Road, a narrow gravel path that cut through a dense state forest. The woods pressed in on both sides, black and impenetrable. Our headlights cut a lonely tunnel through the darkness. There were no streetlights, and the few houses we passed were dark and set far back from the road. I was in the passenger seat, the glow of the laptop illuminating my face as I typed up the report for our cancelled call. My mind was already on my bed, on the promise of sleep. That's when Ron spoke, his voice low. "Do you see that?" He started to slow the ambulance down. I shut the laptop, plunging the cab into darkness, and looked up. I squinted, my eyes adjusting to the night. There, about 100 feet ahead of us, was a dog. But it was a very large dog, with silvery grey fur and pointed ears that had little tufts of hair on the tips. It was walking slowly away from us, and it had a strange, uneven gait, almost like it was limping. The thing was massive. Its shoulders had to be at least 4 feet off the ground. Ron slowed the truck to a crawl. Our immediate thought was that it was injured. A magnificent animal like that had to have an owner somewhere. We figured we'd get a little closer, see if it had a collar, and maybe try to help it. The plan was simple. Ron would put on the flashers, and I would try whistling to see if it was friendly. As we closed the distance, the low rumble of the ambulance's diesel engine seemed unnaturally loud in the silent woods. When we were about 30 feet away, an inexplicable and overwhelming sense of dread washed over both of us simultaneously. It was a primal, gut-level fear. The hair on my arms and neck stood on end. My vision narrowed, and my heart began to hammer against my ribs. My body was screaming at me that I was in terrible danger. That's when the dog stood up. It didn't stand up like a bear or a dog getting on its hind legs, with that characteristic awkwardness. This creature rose up on 2 legs with a fluidity that was both graceful and utterly unnatural. It was clear that this was its natural posture. My perspective was from behind, and the sheer breadth of its shoulders was staggering. They were wider than any man's, rippling with muscle. Ron slammed on the brakes. The creature cocked its head slightly to the left, and a single glowing yellow-green eye caught the light from our headlights. Then, it turned its body toward my side of the road and bolted. It all happened in a matter of seconds. What we saw in that brief moment is something I will never be able to erase from my mind. We both later estimated it to be about 7.5 feet tall. It had a lean, powerful build with a tapered waist and a bushy tail that was at least 3 feet long. Its legs bent backwards like a canine's, with massive clawed feet. The upper body was even more terrifying. When it turned its head, I got a clear profile of its face. It had a long, wolf-like muzzle with a wet, black nose at the end. Its mouth was slightly open, and I could see black gums and a dark purple tongue. It had 2 pairs of fangs, one at the top and one at the bottom, that sat outside its mouth even when it was closed. The eye I saw wasn't just reflecting our headlights. It was glowing with its own internal light. Its arms were almost twice as long as its legs, ending in hands with long, dark claws that had to be 5 or 6 inches long. The creature was pure muscle, a perfectly designed predator. But the most unsettling thing was the intelligence in its eyes. The slight head tilt it gave us wasn't one of a startled animal. It felt like a conscious acknowledgement, a silent message. I know you are here. Move on. You never saw me. Then it was gone. It didn't run into the woods. It bent its powerful legs and leaped, clearing the 6-foot-tall hedgerow and the guardrail behind it with effortless ease. It was a standing jump, a single, explosive movement that carried it up and over, disappearing into the blackness of the forest. Ron didn't hesitate. He stomped on the accelerator, and we tore down that gravel road, the ambulance bouncing and sliding until we were back on a paved street with the comforting glow of streetlights. Neither of us said a word for a long time. There was nothing to say. We had both seen the same impossible thing. In the weeks and months that followed, something was off with Ron. He became quiet and withdrawn. He started requesting that dispatch post us in the downtown area for our entire shift, refusing to take any calls that sent us out to the suburbs or the rural areas after dark. I tried to talk to him about what we had seen, but he would just shut down, changing the subject or refusing to speak about it at all. It put a strange tension between us that had never been there before. I knew he was just as shaken as I was, but I suspected he had seen something more than I had that night. It took years of patient prodding before he finally told me the rest of the story. Our ambulance was a large box truck, and from the driver's seat, Ron had access to a monitor that displayed feeds from several cameras mounted on the vehicle, a backup camera, 2 side cameras, and 1 in the patient compartment. As the passenger, my view was limited, but he could see almost 360 degrees around the truck. He told me that when he first slowed down, he had the same gut feeling I did, that sense of overwhelming dread. But he also had a nagging feeling that the creature in front of us wasn't alone. While my eyes were glued to the werewolf in our headlights, Ron, trusting his instincts, had angled the camera monitor toward himself and started cycling through the feeds. He also flicked on the powerful scene lights that illuminated the sides and rear of the ambulance. When the scene lights came on, he saw them. 2 more of them, coyote tan in color, were crouched on all 4s directly behind our truck, in our blind spot. The rear camera was angled down, so all he could see were the tops of their heads and their massive shoulders and arms. When the bright lights hit them, they bolted to the right, toward the tree line. Ron then switched the monitor to the starboard side camera, hoping to catch another glimpse of them. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. There was another one, this one completely black, standing on its hind legs right next to the ambulance, its hand on the handle of the patient compartment door. It was so massive that it filled the entire camera screen. He glanced at the passenger side mirror, and the black dogman looked right back at him. Its yellow eyes met his, and it pulled its lips back into a terrifying, toothy grin. Ron said he saw the 2 coyote tan creatures leap over the brush behind the grinning one. He told me, his voice trembling even years later, "Danny, if you had rolled down your window and stuck your arm out, you could have shaken hands with it." The grinning creature watched the first one we had seen jump over the hedgerow, then it turned, and as if it was enjoying a private joke, it leaped over the guardrail and followed the others into the woods. As we sped away, I had rolled down my window and heard a strange yapping sound, almost like hyenas. Ron had screamed at me to roll it back up. Knowing his side of the story now makes it all so much worse. We hadn't just stumbled upon a creature in the woods, we had driven right into the middle of a pack. They had a spotter in front of us, with the others hidden in our blind spot. It was a classic ambush. What was their plan? What would have happened if we had been in a smaller car? I have no answers, only more questions that haunt me to this day. I've been a paramedic for over 20 years. You see a lot in that time. You see people at their absolute worst, and occasionally at their very best. You learn that the line between a good day and the worst day of your life is incredibly thin. But this call was different. It wasn't about the aftermath. It was about standing on that thin line and trying to pull someone back. It was a crisp night in late October in upstate New York. The autumn leaves were past their peak, mostly a brown rustling carpet on the ground. My partner and I were nearing the end of a long, quiet shift. We were parked in an empty lot, sipping bad coffee and talking about nothing, just waiting for the clock to run out. Then the call came over the radio, and the casual atmosphere evaporated. Requesting police and EMS to the Old Creek Trestle. We have a report of a female on the tracks. Northbound freight train due in approximately 10 minutes. The Old Creek Trestle was a massive, rusting relic from the turn of the century, a high, skeletal bridge that spanned a wide, dark river. It was a local landmark, a place kids went to drink beer and prove their courage. It was also a tragically popular spot for suicides. We drove as fast as we could, the ambulance bumping down a narrow access road to get close to the tracks. We had to leave the rig and run the last quarter mile. The scene was stark and lonely. A single police car was parked nearby, its lights off. One officer was standing at the edge of the bridge, his hands on his hips, looking helpless. And out in the middle of the trestle, a small figure was standing, silhouetted against the faint glow of the town lights on the other side of the river. I could feel the low, telltale vibration in the rails before I could hear the train. It was coming. I told my partner to stay back with the gear and started walking out onto the bridge. The wooden railway ties were slick with dew, and there were wide gaps between them, where you could see the black, churning water 50 feet below. "Hey," I called out, my voice sounding thin in the open air. "My name's John. I'm a paramedic. Mind if I come out and talk to you?" She didn't move or respond. She was a girl, maybe college-aged, wearing a light jacket that was no match for the autumn chill. As I got closer, I could see she was trembling, either from the cold or from fear. Far down the tracks, I saw a single, bright headlight appear, a tiny star that I knew would grow into a roaring monster all too soon. "It's a beautiful night, isn't it?" I said, trying to sound casual, anything to build a connection. "A little cold, though. You must be freezing." I was about 30 feet from her now. She finally spoke, her voice a fragile whisper that the wind almost carried away. "Go away." "I can't do that," I said gently. "I'm worried about you. It looks like you're in a lot of pain." The train horn blew then, a long, mournful cry that echoed across the valley. The vibration in the rails was stronger now. She flinched at the sound, but didn't move. "He was supposed to be here," she said suddenly, her voice cracking. "We were going to go together. He promised." A suicide pact, and her partner had bailed. In that horrific detail, I saw my only opening. It was a desperate gamble. "He promised you, and then he left you here to do this by yourself?" I asked, my voice hardening slightly. "He let you walk out onto this bridge alone while he's somewhere safe and warm? That doesn't sound like love. That sounds like cowardice." She turned her head then and looked at me for the first time. Her face was tear-streaked, her eyes wide with a pain so deep, it was bottomless. "You don't know anything," she sobbed. "I know what I see," I said, taking a few more cautious steps. The train's light was growing, painting the sides of the trees along the track. The roar was building. "I see a brave girl who is hurting, and I see a coward who broke her heart and left her to die. Don't you dare die for a coward. His decision doesn't have to be yours. Your life is worth more than his broken promise." The ground was shaking now. The roar was deafening, a physical presence that hammered at my chest. The headlight was a blinding sun, washing out everything. I had maybe 10 seconds. I closed the remaining distance between us. "Please," I yelled over the noise. "Take my hand. Choose to live. Do it for you, not for him." I reached out my hand. Her eyes were locked on the oncoming train, mesmerized. For a heart-stopping second, I thought she was lost. Then her eyes flickered to mine, and her small, icy hand grabbed my own. I pulled her back with every ounce of strength I had. We stumbled backward on the slick ties, our feet tangling, and fell in a heap onto the gravel service path, just as the locomotive screamed past, its massive steel body missing us by inches. The wind from the passing freight cars was a hurricane, threatening to pull us under the wheels. I held onto her, shielding her with my body until the last car had passed. And then there was silence, a profound, ringing silence broken only by her ragged, gasping sobs. She didn't let go of my hand for a very long time. I was a young officer, still new enough to the job that everything felt raw and unfiltered. Every call was a new experience, and I had not yet built up the calluses that a long career in law enforcement inevitably creates. This particular call, on a humid summer night in 2014, was the one that scraped away my remaining innocence and showed me the true depths of human cruelty. It started as a domestic abuse call, a routine event in the district I worked. The call came from a neighbor who reported a history of loud arguments and violence from the house next door. My partner John and I arrived at a small single-story house on a quiet, tree-lined street. The house was dark, and there was an eerie silence that felt wrong. We knocked on the front door, announcing ourselves as police. No response. We knocked again, louder this time, our voices sharp in the still night air. Nothing. Following protocol, we made the decision to force entry. John used a tool to pry the door open, and we stepped inside, our hands on our weapons. The inside of the house was surprisingly neat. The living room was tidy, with magazines fanned out on a coffee table. but there was a feeling of tension in the air, a stillness that was heavy and ominous. We moved through the house room by room, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. In the master bedroom, we found her. The wife. She was lying in her bed, beaten to death. It was a brutal, violent scene, and the image is still seared into my memory. As we backed out of the bedroom to preserve the scene, we began to notice other things. There was blood in other parts of the house, not just the bedroom. There were small smears on the hallway wall, a bloody handprint on a doorknob, a trail of droplets leading towards the back of the house. And then there was the smell. At first, we thought one of us had stepped in something outside, but the odor was strong and pervasive. It was the smell of feces, the smell of pure, abject terror. Our sense of dread grew with every step we took. We followed the trail of blood and the worsening smell down the hallway, past a bathroom and a small laundry room. The trail led to a closed door at the very end of the hall. John pushed the door open, and our flashlights fell upon a scene of unimaginable horror. The couple's son, a little boy of about 8 or 9 years old, was dead. He was in a back storage room, huddled in a corner. The pieces of the story clicked into place with sickening clarity. The husband, the boy's stepfather, had gotten into an argument with his wife and had bludgeoned her to death in their bedroom. The noise must have woken up the little boy. He walked into his parents' room and saw what his stepfather had done. The man then turned on the child. The boy, in a desperate fight for his life, managed to get away from the initial attack. He ran. He ran through the house he had probably played in just hours before, bleeding and terrified. The blood on the walls, on the doorknobs, was his. He was trying to escape the monster that had just killed his mother. The smell was from the boy soiling himself in absolute fear as he was being hunted down in his own home. His stepfather caught him in that back room and finished what he had started. The stepfather was gone. He had fled the scene after committing the 2 murders. We put out an alert for his vehicle, and the search began. But he did not get far. A few hours later, we got word that he had been found. He had driven to a secluded area and ended his own life before we could catch him. I remember standing outside the house after the detectives and forensics team had arrived. The quiet, tree-lined street was now filled with flashing red and blue lights. Neighbors were gathered on their lawns, watching with horrified expressions. But all I could think about was that little boy. I could not shake the image of his desperate, terrified flight through the house. It was not a long run, a hallway, a few rooms. But for him, it must have been the longest and most horrifying journey of his short life. That call taught me a hard lesson that night. I learned that the worst monsters are not the ones that hide in the dark, but the ones that live inside ordinary houses on quiet, peaceful streets. It is a story I have rarely told, but it is one that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I have been a cop for over a decade, and I have seen my fair share of strange things. I have dealt with people high on every drug imaginable, seeing things that are not there. I have been to homes where the residents were convinced they were being watched by the government through their microwaves. You learn to develop a filter for what is real and what is a product of a troubled mind. But there was one call, back in the fall of 2022, that I still cannot explain. It defied all logic and left me with a chill that has never quite gone away. It was about 1 a.m, a couple of weeks after Halloween. The novelty of the season had worn off, but some houses still had a few lingering decorations. My partner and I got a call for a prowler. We rolled up to a nice 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The residents, a middle-aged couple, met us at the door. They were perfectly calm and articulate, not drunk or high. They told us they had seen 2 people in their neighbor's yard across the street. The strange part was that they were wearing masks. One was a classic Jason-style hockey mask, and the other was a plain, white, featureless mask. Given that Halloween had just passed, it was not completely out of the realm of possibility that it was just some kids messing around. We took our flashlights and did a thorough search of the area. We checked the neighbor's yard, looked in the bushes, and walked the perimeter of the block. We found nothing. No footprints in the soft dirt of the flower beds, no discarded masks. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. We went back to the couple, told them we had not found anything, and advised them to call back if they saw them again. We cleared the call and went back on patrol. An hour later, the call came back. It was the same address. This time, the situation was different. The wife was on the phone with our dispatcher, giving a live play-by-play of what she was seeing. She said the two masked figures were back in the same yard, just standing there by a large wooden shed. This time, we did not go in alone. We had 2 other units meet us there. The plan was to set up a perimeter and move in together. There were 5 of us in total, positioned perfectly around the property. I took a position along a fence line that gave me a clear view of the shed. Our dispatcher was still on the phone with the resident, relaying their movements to us over the radio. "Dispatch to units. The caller states the subjects are still visible by the shed." Her voice crackled in my earpiece. We began to move in, slowly and quietly, using the darkness and the landscaping for cover. I was about 20 feet from the shed, my heart pounding in my chest. "They see you," the dispatcher's voice said. "The caller says the 2 subjects just turned and waved at her window." A cold feeling washed over me. This was no longer just a prowler call. It was something else, something deeply unsettling. "Dispatch, be advised. Subjects are now moving towards the shed," the radio continued. "Caller states they are opening the door. They have now gone inside the shed." I was the closest one. The shed was right in front of me. The other officers were moving to support my position. "This is Officer Miller," I said into my radio, my voice low and steady. "I am at the shed. I have the door covered." I took a deep breath, drew my weapon, and yelled, "Police, come out with your hands up." Silence. I repeated the command, louder this time. Still nothing. I could hear the other officers getting into place behind me. There was no way out of the shed except for the door I was watching. "Screw it," I muttered to my partner. "I'm going in." I moved to the side of the door and pushed it open with my foot. It swung inward with a loud creak, revealing the dark interior. I pointed my flashlight inside, sweeping the beam across the small space. It was empty, completely and utterly empty. There were some old gardening tools, a lawnmower, and a few dusty boxes, but no people. I stepped inside, my partner right behind me. We checked behind the lawnmower, under a workbench. There was nowhere to hide. I even looked up at the rafters, thinking they might have climbed up. Nothing. I stomped on the wooden floor, looking for a trap door. It was solid. The shed was built on a concrete slab, raised only a few inches off the ground. There was no secret tunnel, no hidden exit. They could not have gotten out. It was impossible. We searched the entire area again, this time with a fine-tooth comb. We found nothing. I went back to talk to the residents. They were visibly shaken. The wife described what she had seen in more detail. She said that, as she saw my silhouette moving along the fence line, the 2 figures turned to look at her window. The one in the hockey mask put a single finger to where his lips would be, in a clear shh gesture. Then they both gave a slow, deliberate wave before turning and walking calmly into the shed. They went inside just as I was taking my position by the door. We spent another hour there, going over every possibility. Could the residents have been lying or hallucinating? They had no history of false calls, and they both told the exact same story, down to the smallest detail. Could the prowlers have somehow slipped past us? With 5 officers surrounding a small, well-lit yard, it seemed impossible. We could not come up with a single logical explanation for what had happened. I am not a big believer in the paranormal. I am a cop. I deal in facts and evidence. But that night, I was faced with a situation that had neither. I saw an empty shed that I knew, with absolute certainty, should have had 2 people inside it. I still drive through that neighborhood sometimes, and every time I pass that house, I look at the shed in the yard across the street and feel that same cold chill run down my spine. I was 19 years old and working what I thought would be a simple, low-risk job as an unarmed security guard. My post was a government-run homeless outreach office that shared a building with a daytime shelter. The office was on the top floor and dealt with mental health services, so it wasn't uncommon for us to have clients who were unpredictable. My job was basically to be a visible presence, to de-escalate situations, and to call the police if things got out of hand. I was a scarecrow in a uniform, and I knew it. One afternoon, a regular client came in. Let's call him Jones. Jones was a quiet man usually. He would come in, pick up his medication, and leave without a word. But on this day, he was different. His eyes were wide, and he moved with a jerky, nervous energy. He collected his meds from Betty, the receptionist, but instead of leaving, he walked over to a threadbare couch in the waiting area and sat down. From my post at the front desk, I watched him. He started digging through a grimy backpack, and after a moment, he pulled out a small plastic bag filled with white pills. This immediately put me on high alert. He then picked up a heavy ceramic coffee mug from the end table, and with a series of sharp, cracking sounds, he smashed 3 or 4 of the pills into a fine powder on the table's surface. With the edge of a library card, he carefully arranged the dust into 3 neat lines. Then he leaned over and snorted all 3 lines in quick succession, the sound loud and wet in the quiet office. This was so far beyond a simple disturbance that I knew I had to act. I walked over, trying to keep my voice calm and non-threatening. "Sir," I said, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You can't do that in here." He didn't look at me. He just continued to stare at the white residue on the table. "I'm just taking my meds," he said, his voice a low monotone. "You've already got your medication, sir," I said, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "It's time to go." Then he turned his head slowly and looked at me. He leaned in, and a sour smell came off of him. He whispered, so quietly that only I could hear, "You know, I've got a suppressed 9mm in my bag. It'll make you and Betty the receptionist shut up real quick." A jolt of pure terror shot through me. This was no longer a simple problem. This was a potential active shooter scenario, and I was a 19-year-old kid with a walkie-talkie. I took a step back, my mind racing. I had to get everyone else to safety without panicking him. I walked back to the reception desk, every step feeling like I was wading through cement. I could feel his eyes on my back the entire way. I leaned over the counter and whispered to Betty, "There's a man here with a gun. Call 911, then get the other client and lock yourselves in an exam room. Do not open the door for anyone." I saw the color drain from her face, but to her credit, she didn't panic. She nodded, her hand already reaching for the phone. As she quietly alerted the other caseworkers, I turned my attention back to Jones. He was still sitting on the couch, watching me with a faint, unnerving smile. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. The office behind me was now in silent lockdown. It was just me and him in the lobby. The silence was deafening. He started humming, a tuneless, discordant sound that grated on my nerves. He reached into his backpack and slowly began taking things out and arranging them on the coffee table. A half-eaten sandwich, a worn-out Bible, a single dirty sock. It was all so mundane, yet so terrifying in its deliberateness. I stood by the door, trying to look calm, my mind cycling through my completely inadequate training. What was I supposed to do if he pulled out the gun? I told him again that the police were on their way. He just kept humming. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he slowly stood up. He packed his things back into his bag, zipped it up, and walked toward me. He stopped right in front of me, so close I could see the burst blood vessels in his eyes. "I'm coming back for you one day," he said, his voice a soft conversational promise. Then he turned and walked out the door. The police arrived 5 minutes later. They took my statement, examined the security footage, and took a sample of the powder left on the table. A few days later, my boss informed me of the outcome. The police had found Jones, but he had no gun. The powder on the table turned out to be his own crushed-up antipsychotic medication. He had apparently lost the bottle they came in. Nothing violent had happened. But that didn't matter. For those 10 minutes, locked in that silent lobby, that gun was real. The threat was the weapon. It scared the crap out of me, and it changed the way I saw my job. I left that post a few months later. I couldn't shake the feeling, every time a new client walked through the door, that I was just waiting for Jones to come back and keep his promise. When I was a kid, my family's life revolved around the desert. Specifically, a massive expanse of sand dunes in California called Glamis. My dad had been going there for over 20 years, and he started taking me when I was just a baby. It was a wild place, especially back then, in the early 2000s. During the day, it was a paradise for off-road enthusiasts. At night, it transformed into a chaotic, alcohol-fueled party, and it could be incredibly dangerous. I was about 9 years old during the trip that I'll never forget. We were camped out with a large group of other families, our motorhomes circled up like a wagon train, with a huge bonfire in the middle. My dad had a custom-built sand buggy with a monstrous 1100 horsepower engine. It was his pride and joy. Unfortunately, my dad and my stepmom had a volatile relationship, and their fights were legendary. That night, they got into a huge one. It was loud and ugly, and the whole camp fell into an awkward silence, everyone pretending not to listen. In a rage, my dad stormed over to his buggy, ripped the tarp off, and started getting it ready to go for a ride. Even at 9, I knew this was a terrible idea. He had been drinking all day. I begged him not to go. My stepmom pleaded with him. One of the other men in our camp even tried to reason with him, but my dad ignored everyone. He fired up the engine, which roared like a dragon, and tore out of the camp, spraying a massive plume of sand behind him. The mood at the campfire was tense. Everyone was stressed out, and I was silently freaking out, my stomach in knots. Hours crawled by. It felt like an eternity. I sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, my eyes scanning the dark horizon, praying for the sound of his engine. I remember my stepbrother had given up and gone inside to watch a movie, but I couldn't relax. It was well after midnight when we finally heard it. The buggy came flying into camp. He slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt, and immediately, frantically, started trying to cover the buggy with the tarp, as if he were trying to hide it. He was acting incredibly strange, pacing around and avoiding everyone's eyes. Finally, he came over to the fire and sat down without saying a word. I knew, with the certainty of a child who knows his parents all too well, that something was very, very wrong. Not 5 minutes later, the night exploded with light and sound. Sirens wailed from every direction. The flashing red and blue lights of 6 police SUVs flooded our camp. A voice from a megaphone boomed, "Brian, get down on the ground, hands where I can see them." I was in our trailer, just about to get into bed, when the chaos erupted. I ran to the window and saw them, the police swarming my dad. I screamed and ran outside, but one of the men from our camp grabbed me mid-sprint, holding me back. "No, you can't go to your dad right now," he said, keeping me behind him as I screamed and cried my dad's name. My stepmom, drunk and furious, ran toward my dad, trying to shield him from the police. Then a massive spotlight cut through the darkness from above. A helicopter was circling our campsite, its beam fixed on the scene. It was the most terrifying moment of my life. I was sobbing uncontrollably, convinced my dad was going to prison, or worse. They had him cuffed, face down on the hood of a police SUV. Then, just as my 9-year-old world was collapsing, a voice came over the helicopter's loudspeaker. "Thanks for the ride, Brian." It boomed and the helicopter flew off. Everything stopped. The cops started laughing. They uncuffed my dad, and even my dad was laughing. The sirens and lights went off. I stood there, utterly bewildered, my tears still wet on my face. It had all been an elaborate prank. My dad, in his drunken anger, had driven out to Oldsmobile Hill, a massive dune, that was a popular racing spot but was closed at night. He ran right into a group of rangers and the helicopter crew at the bottom of the hill. He thought he was in huge trouble, but it turned out they needed to get the helicopter's co-pilot back up to the top of the dune, and their SUVs couldn't make the climb. They asked my dad if he could give him a ride in his buggy. My dad, ever the showman, proceeded to spend the next few hours giving all the cops and the flight crew thrilling rides up and down the giant dune. They were all just killing time, and they were blown away by the power of his buggy. At the end of it all, they asked him if there was any way they could repay him. My dad, jokingly, asked them to stage a fake arrest when he got back to camp. To his surprise, they all enthusiastically agreed. Most of the adults in our camp thought it was the coolest thing they had ever seen. But I was traumatized. My stepmom was beyond furious. I just remember being so angry and confused. The emotional whiplash from absolute terror to the bizarre revelation that it was all a joke was too much for my young mind to handle. For years, I would ask my dad if that night really happened, because it felt too insane to be real. Now, as an adult, I can see the humor in it. I can understand why it's a cool story, but I can also still feel the echo of that 9-year-old boy's terror. And I know that, for me, it was never really a joke. I was working as a nurse at an Ebola clinic in Liberia during the major outbreak. Most of the patients who succumbed to the virus didn't hemorrhage as dramatically as the media portrayed. There was vomiting and diarrhea, but usually not the hot zone level of body fluid expulsion you see in movies. Except for one man. It was just me, a Liberian nurse named Amara, and a Liberian sprayer named Joseph. We were all clad in our cumbersome, suffocating protective suits, a routine we had performed so many times, it had become second nature. The process was always a stark reminder of the invisible enemy we were fighting. First came the scrubs, then the rubber boots, then the first pair of gloves. Then came the white Tyvek suit, zipping it up to the chin, pulling the hood over our heads. A second pair of gloves went on, taped securely to the sleeves of the suit. Then the face mask, the goggles, and finally the face shield. Breathing became a conscious effort, and within minutes, sweat would be pouring down my body. We suited up to retrieve a man from the back of the ambulance, which was just a pickup truck with a covered bed and a washable mattress laid in the back. The man was in his early 20s and was in terrible condition. He managed to crawl onto the stretcher we laid out for him. He was sweating profusely, and his eyes were already the deep blood-red color that signaled the final stages of the disease. He didn't speak any English, just muttered in his native dialect between groans of pain. As we were about to lift him, he rolled onto his side and began to vomit. It wasn't a normal vomit. A slow, gelatinous mass rolled out of his mouth, as dark as a moonless night. It had the thick consistency of jello. It left his body in a single, cohesive blob and splattered against the canvas of the stretcher, covering the lower part of my protective suit in dark, clotted blood. For the 2 seconds, it was airborne. Before it hit the stretcher, it seemed to have a life of its own. It was the physical embodiment of the virus. We followed our protocol. We washed the man off with a 0.05% bleach solution and brought him into the clinic. We ran a rapid Ebola test and started him on an IV drip, pushing a liter of fluid. We also managed to get him to drink a liter of oral rehydration salts. Miraculously, he perked up. He sat up in his cot, asked for food, and ate a large portion of fufu, a local staple. For a brief moment, we thought we had turned a corner. We allowed ourselves a flicker of hope that he might be one of the few who would make it. He was dead 2 hours later. To this day, I cannot look at Jello without thinking of him and that horrifying moment. The image is burned into my memory, a permanent stain from a time spent fighting a war against an enemy I could never see. It was a brutally hot and humid July in rural Georgia. The air was so thick you could almost drink it, and the sky had been a threatening shade of purple all day. A massive, multi-day country music festival had just wrapped up, leaving behind a sprawling field of mud, discarded beer cans, and abandoned campsites. I was a sheriff's deputy, and my partner and I were tasked with patrolling the area, mostly to shoo away any stragglers or scavengers. Around 1 in the morning, the sky finally broke open. A torrential thunderstorm rolled in, with lightning that lit up the apocalyptic landscape of the festival grounds like a strobe light. It was during a lull in the thunder that we got the call. A single report of a popping sound like a gunshot from the north end of the fields. My sergeant's voice on the radio was skeptical. "Probably some idiot with leftover fireworks," he said. "Go take a look, but don't get stuck in the mud." We drove our cruiser as far as we could, the tires slipping and sliding on the muddy track. The field was a ghost town, rows upon rows of empty tents and deflated pool floats, looking sad and pathetic in the rain. We got out, our heavy flashlights cutting weak beams through the downpour. The place had a spooky, end-of-the-world vibe. We split up, systematically checking the tents. Most were empty, some with sleeping bags and coolers left behind in a hasty departure. After about 20 minutes of this, I saw it. Under a large blue canopy tent, a figure was sitting in a camping chair. The person was motionless, slumped forward. My first thought was that it was a concert goer who had passed out drunk and been left behind. "Sheriff's office," I called out as I approached, my boots making sucking sounds in the mud. "Sir, you okay? Festival's over, you gotta pack it up." There was no response. As I got closer, about 20 feet away, my flashlight beam caught the glint of metal on the ground next to the chair. It was a shotgun. My posture changed instantly. I slowed my approach, my hand hovering over my sidearm. "Sir," I said, my voice now low and firm, "I need to see your hands." The rain was hammering on the vinyl roof of the tent, a deafening drumbeat. I circled around to the front of the chair, my heart pounding against my ribs. He had done it. The shotgun blast had taken most of his head with it. The scene was gruesome, but after a few years on the job, you learn to see it with a clinical detachment. I noted the position of the body, the location of the weapon. I got on my radio and called for my partner, the sergeant, and the coroner. While I waited, I stood under the relative shelter of the tent, the rain pouring down all around me. I felt a drop of water hit the back of my neck. I wiped it away, annoyed. Probably a leak in the cheap tent. Then I felt another drop, this one on my cheek. I looked up at the blue vinyl roof expecting to see a tear. The tent was intact. Confused, I held my hand out, palm up. A drop landed squarely in the center of my palm. It wasn't clear. It was dark, thick, and warm. A wave of absolute horror washed over me as I realized what was happening. It wasn't a leak. I slowly, reluctantly, pointed my high-powered flashlight straight up at the inside of the canopy. In the brilliant white beam, the roof of the tent was revealed to be a nightmare. It was coated from one end to the other in a fine, atomized spray of blood, brain matter, and bone fragments. The force of the shotgun blast had turned the man's head into a liquid and painted the entire ceiling with it. Now, in the humidity of the storm, the horrific mixture was congealing, forming heavier droplets and dripping back down on me. I scrambled out from under the tent, gagging, and fell to my knees in the mud. I was covered in it. My uniform, my face, my hair. I felt a primal, desperate need to scrub my own skin off. My partner found me there a minute later, retching into the mud, the rain washing the filth from the sky and the filth from the dead man all over me. That night broke something in my professional detachment. For years afterward, on hot, humid nights, I would sometimes feel a phantom drop on the back of my neck and have to fight the urge to scream. My name is Mark, and for nearly a decade, I was an EMT. I should say, I used to be an EMT. I recently resigned after what my former employers called a conflict of interest. For most of my life, I've lived in a small town in rural Pennsylvania, a beautiful piece of Appalachia if you can look past the opioid epidemic that has ravaged the region. Our county had one of the highest rates of heroin overdose cases in the state, a fact I can personally verify from my time on the job. You never forget your first truly bad call. The experience is something like losing your virginity, except it's rarely a pleasant memory. Mine was a car wreck. An 18-wheeler had clipped a small red Chevy Cobalt. The Semi was practically unscathed, but the Cobalt was destroyed. The driver of the car, a young woman, had swerved and hit the guardrail, causing the car to flip. My partner for that shift was Michael, a great guy who had been on the job for 4 years before I started. He had a bit of a morbid sense of humor, but that's something you develop in this line of work to stay sane. We arrived on the scene about 3 minutes after the call came in. As we were approaching what was left of the Cobalt, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Lying on the side of the road, about 50 feet from the car, was the driver. Even from a distance, I could tell she wasn't going to make it. Her lower jaw was a mangled mess, and I could see the white glint of bone sticking out of her forearm. Jesus Christ, I muttered, completely shocked. How did she? That's why you wear a seatbelt, rookie, Mike said grimly. Last thing you want is to go through a windshield at 60 miles per hour. His words hit even harder when we got closer and realized she was still alive. I doubt most people can even imagine the horrific sounds a person makes when their jaw is little more than ground meat. It was a wet, gurgling sound mixed with a desperate, wheezing gasp for air. We had her on a stretcher and in another ambulance within seconds. I sometimes try to imagine that she made a miraculous recovery, but I know better. With injuries like that, her life would have been short and agonizing, but that wasn't what truly broke me that night. After she was taken away, we went to inspect the Cobalt. There was a massive streak of blood, mixed with brain matter and fragments of bone, that started where the car had flipped and ended near the rear passenger window. My heart sank. I took a closer look, and that's when I heard it. The faint sound of crying from inside the car. It turned out the driver was a babysitter. She had 2 little girls in the back seats, but there was only one open seatbelt. In an act of unbelievable carelessness, she had stacked the children on top of each other, and they were sharing a single seatbelt. A reckless driver, improperly secured children, and an open window. It was a recipe for disaster. We had to use tools to cut through the roof of the car to get to the girls. When I looked down through the hole we had made, something inside of me died. The surviving girl was sitting there with her sister's decapitated corpse in her lap. She was clutching the body as if her own life depended on it. She looked up at me through the hole in the roof, her eyes filled with a sorrow that no child should ever have to experience. I broke. I pulled her out of that wreck and just held her, tears streaming down my face. I told her it was all going to be okay and that we would get her home soon. As I carried her to our ambulance, Mike confirmed that the other child was dead. That's when the little girl in my arms said something that has haunted my nightmares ever since. "Why are you leaving Veronica?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you leaving my sister? She's hurt. Please, mister, can't you help her?" I still have nightmares about that night, about that little girl, Abigail, and her sister, Veronica. I see their faces. I hear that question, and I don't know how much longer I can live with it. I'm sorry I couldn't help her, Abby. I'm so sorry. The interstate is a river of steel and glass that flows through the heart of the county where I work. My job, as a state trooper in the sun-bleached landscape of central Arizona, is to be a lifeguard for that river. Most days, it is a slow, monotonous current of routine traffic stops and fender benders. You hand out tickets, you offer a bit of roadside assistance, and you become jaded by the endless, predictable stupidity of people behind the wheel. You think you have seen it all. Then a day comes along that reminds you that the river has a dark, deep, and brutally unforgiving undertow. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the late spring of 2024, the kind of day when the heat radiating off the asphalt creates shimmering, watery mirages in the distance. I was at the tail end of a long, uneventful shift, my mind already drifting towards a cold beer and a quiet evening at home. The radio crackled, and the dispatcher's voice, usually a calm, laconic drawl, was tight with an urgency that instantly brought me to full alert. All units, Major MVA, I-10 eastbound, mile marker 152, semi versus passenger vehicle, multiple reports of entrapment and serious injuries. I was the closest unit. I hit my lights and siren and pushed the patrol car as hard as it would go, weaving through the slower traffic that had not yet been ensnared by the inevitable gridlock. I crested a small hill, and I saw it. The scene was a tableau of apocalyptic chaos. A semi-truck, its massive chrome grille buckled and twisted, was jackknifed across all 3 lanes of the highway. And wedged underneath its front bumper was a small silver sedan, crushed to about half its original size, a mangled, unrecognizable piece of scrap metal. Smoke and steam hissed from the wreckage, and the air was thick with the smell of burnt rubber, diesel fuel, and the sharp coppery tang of leaking fluids. I was the first on the scene. I parked my cruiser to block the remaining open lane and ran towards the wreckage. The first thing I encountered was the driver of the truck, a big man with a graying beard, who was stumbling around in a daze, a cut on his forehead bleeding freely down his face. "She just stopped," he kept saying, his voice a hoarse, disbelieving whisper. There was nothing I could do. She just stopped. Then I heard the screaming. It was a woman's voice, a raw, animalistic sound of pure, unadulterated panic and pain. It was coming from the driver's side of the crushed sedan. The driver's door was gone, sheared off in the impact, and a woman was half sprawled out onto the pavement, her body tangled in the twisted metal of the car frame. Her one leg was bent at a horrifying, unnatural angle, the bone clearly visible through the torn fabric of her jeans. But she was not screaming about her leg. She was screaming a name, a word, something unintelligible, her face a mask of frantic, desperate terror. My training kicked in. I knelt down beside her, trying to keep her still, trying to assess her injuries. "Ma'am, my name is Trooper Davies," I said, my voice the calm, authoritative instrument I had been trained to use. "Help is on the way. You're going to be okay. Can you tell me your name?" She did not seem to hear me. Her eyes were not focused on me. They were fixed on the back of her own car, on the mangled, compressed wreckage. She grabbed the front of my uniform, her grip surprisingly strong, and screamed in my face, her breath hot and panicked. "My baby!" she shrieked. "You have to get my baby!" A cold, heavy dread settled in my stomach. The back of the car was not a passenger compartment anymore. It was a solid, compressed block of steel and glass. There was no way anyone, especially a child, could have survived that. I tried to calm her, to tell her that the firefighters were coming with tools to get to the back seat, but she was lost in a world of pure, primal terror, her screams tearing at the hot, still air. I needed to get her identification for the paramedics who were just arriving on the scene. I told her I was going to look in her car for her purse, a small, practical lie in the face of an unthinkable truth. I moved to the other side of the car. The passenger side was less damaged. The door was wedged shut, but the window was shattered. I leaned into the car, my boots crunching on the glittering carpet of broken glass. And then I heard it. Over the growing cacophony of approaching sirens and the woman's continued screams, there was another sound. It was a faint, tinny, and completely, surreally out-of-place sound. It was the cheerful, sing-songy music of a children's television show. I was confused. I scanned the interior of the car. The front passenger seat was empty. The back seat was a twisted ruin. I leaned further in, following the sound. It was coming from the floor of the back seat, from the crumpled, dark space behind the driver's seat. I saw the faint, blue glow of a screen. It was a laptop, lying on the floor, its screen still lit, the cheerful, animated face of a cartoon dog dancing and singing. It must have been thrown there in the crash. I reached in, my intention to just move it, to get it out of the way. My fingers closed around the plastic casing of the laptop, and as I lifted it, I saw what was underneath. The world stopped. The sounds of the highway, the sirens, the screaming, it all faded away into a distant, muffled roar. My universe shrank to the small, dark space at my feet. It was the baby. A little girl, no more than 2 years old, dressed in a pink t-shirt and overalls. She had not been in a car seat. She had been sitting on the back seat with a laptop on her lap. On impact, her tiny, unrestrained body had become a projectile, launched forward into the back of the driver's seat, and the laptop, a hard, unyielding piece of plastic and metal, had been the battering ram. Her skull was crushed. The cheerful, glowing screen of the laptop was cracked, and the cartoon dog was still dancing, its happy theme song the only sound in the sudden, terrible silence of my own mind. I do not remember staggering back from the car. I do not remember getting on my radio, my voice a choked, broken thing, and telling dispatch to add a coroner to the call. I just remember standing on the side of the interstate, the sun beating down on my head as the world of chaos slowly came back into focus. I looked at the mother, now surrounded by paramedics, still screaming for her baby. Her physical pain from her broken leg was nothing compared to the pain that was about to hit her, a pain that would last for the rest of her life. In the years since that call, I have become an absolute tyrant when it comes to child restraint laws. I have written hundreds of citations, each one with a cold, unforgiving fury. I have given lectures at community events, my voice shaking with a passion that most people do not understand. They see a cop obsessed with a minor infraction. They do not see what I see. They do not see the dancing blue dog. They do not hear the cheerful, tinny music. And they do not see the small, still body lying in the darkness. A victim, not of a malicious act, but of a single, catastrophic, and completely preventable moment of carelessness. I'm a paramedic in the suburbs of Chicago, a sprawling landscape of quiet neighborhoods connected by a web of metro train lines. For most people, the sound of a train horn is just background noise. For us, it's often the prelude to the worst calls we will ever get. We call them person under a train. They are, without exception, horrific. There's no saving anyone. The job becomes a grim, surreal Easter egg hunt, walking the tracks with a flashlight and a biohazard bag, looking for pieces of what was once a person. You have to have a certain kind of despair to choose that way to go. But this one call was different. It wasn't an aftermath. It was a beginning. The call came in at dusk, that hazy time when the sky is a bruised purple and the streetlights are just starting to glow. Psychiatric emergency, the dispatcher's voice said, a little too quickly. Female on the metro tracks, northbound train approaching. My partner Dave and I exchanged a look. There's a special kind of urgency for these calls. A train weighing thousands of tons and moving at 50 miles an hour needs over a mile to come to a complete stop. Every second is a lifetime. Dave hit the lights and siren, and we tore through the suburban streets. When we arrived, the scene was already steeped in tension. The crossing gates were down, their red lights flashing in the twilight, the bells clanging a frantic, monotonous rhythm. A police car was parked haphazardly on the side of the road, and there, in the middle of the tracks, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 18 or 19, just standing there, her back to us, facing down the tracks toward the single bright headlight of the approaching train. The train's horn was blasting now, a deep, mournful sound that seemed to shake the very air. A police officer was already out of his car, shouting at her, but she didn't move. She was like a statue. Dave and I grabbed our jump kit, though we knew this wouldn't be a medical intervention, not yet anyway. I told Dave to stay back, and I started walking toward her, moving along the gravel next to the tracks. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to pitch my voice over the bells and the train horn. "My name is Sam. I'm a paramedic. Can I talk to you for a second?" She didn't turn around. The ground was starting to vibrate, a low thrum that was growing stronger by the second. The train was close, dangerously close. I was about 20 feet away from her now. "I know you're hurting," I said, my voice louder, more urgent. "But this isn't the way. Just talk to me. What's your name?" For the first time, she spoke, her voice surprisingly clear and calm over the noise. "It doesn't matter," she said without turning. "It matters to me," I shot back. "Please just step off the tracks. We can talk about whatever's going on." The train's headlight was now a blinding glare, silhouetting her small frame. The roar was becoming deafening. My own survival instincts were screaming at me to get away, but I couldn't leave her there. "He was supposed to be here," she said suddenly, her voice cracking with the first hint of emotion. "We were supposed to do it together. We made a pact." My heart broke for her. A suicide pact, and he had abandoned her. "He's a coward," I said, taking another step closer. "He left you here to do this alone. Is that what you want? To die for a coward?" She flinched, as if my words had physically struck her. The ground was shaking violently now. The train was maybe 1,000 feet away, a roaring monster of steel and light. I had seconds. "His cowardice doesn't have to be your death sentence," I yelled, my throat raw. "You can make a different choice. Right now. Take my hand. Live." I was right next to her now, and I reached out my hand. For a terrifying second, she just stood there, mesmerized by the oncoming light. I thought I had failed. Then, her small, cold hand slipped into mine. I didn't hesitate. I pulled her with all my strength, half dragging, half throwing her off the tracks and onto the gravel embankment. We tumbled to the ground just as the train thundered past, its horn a triumphant, deafening scream. The wind it generated was a physical blow, whipping at our clothes and filling the air with the smell of diesel and hot metal. It was over in a few seconds. The last car passed, and the silence that followed was shocking. The girl lay on the gravel next to me and finally began to sob. Not quiet tears, but huge, body-racking sobs of grief and fear and relief. We got her into the ambulance. She was safe. We had won. It's a small victory in a job that is so often about managing loss. Most of the time, we are just witnesses to tragedy. But that night, we got to change the ending. I never found out what happened to that girl, or to the boy who broke his promise. But I hope that somewhere, she found a reason to be grateful for the life she almost threw away. The call came in as a check welfare, one of the most unpredictable calls you can get. It could be anything from a senior citizen who fell and can't get up to something far, far worse. This one was at a long-term pediatric care facility, a place that was always emotionally heavy. It was a bright, oppressively hot day in a suburb outside Phoenix, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and tempers run short. I was the first officer on the scene. The facility director, a woman with a frazzled, exhausted look in her eyes, met me at the door. She told me about Clara, one of their best nurses. She was reliable, compassionate, a model employee. But that morning she'd shown up on her day off with her 2-year-old son, Leo, and something was terribly wrong. Clara had walked into the facility and straight to the room of a young patient, a little girl with a severe respiratory condition. Clara had announced that the girl was her daughter and that the doctors were trying to poison her. She had tried to disconnect the girl's monitors and take her out of the room, screaming that she was rescuing her. The staff had managed to intervene, but Clara was now in the lobby, refusing to leave, still insisting that the child inside was her own. I found her sitting on a plush couch in the brightly colored lobby. Her son, Leo, was playing with some blocks on the floor beside her. She looked perfectly normal. Her hair was neat, her clothes were clean. But when I started talking to her, I felt a chill despite the desert heat. She spoke to me in a calm, rational tone, but her words were completely detached from reality. She explained, with intricate, fabricated detail, her daughter's real medical history and the conspiracy by the hospital staff. Her eyes were like polished glass. There was a light in them, but it wasn't a human light. It was just a reflection. I tried to reason with her, to gently point out the inconsistencies in her story. It was like talking to a brick wall. The facility didn't want to press charges. They wanted to get her help. The problem was, she was not an immediate threat to herself or others, at least not overtly. I didn't have the legal grounds for an emergency psychiatric hold. My only option was to call her family. Her father, a kind, tired-looking man in his 60s, arrived about 30 minutes later. His face was a mask of confusion and fear. "I don't understand," he kept saying. "She was fine last night. We had dinner. She was laughing." He went to talk to her, and I gave them some space, watching from a distance. I saw him talking to her, his expression shifting from pleading to bewildered, to utterly heartbroken. After a few minutes, he walked back over to me, his shoulders slumped. He looked me in the eye, and his voice was thick with a grief that I couldn't comprehend. "Officer," he said, "that woman looks exactly like my daughter, Clara. But I am telling you, that is not my daughter. I don't know who that is, but it's not her. There's nothing there. She's gone." Just as he finished speaking, I heard a sharp click, followed by the solid chunk of a car's power locks. My head snapped toward the parking lot. Clara had slipped out during our conversation and was now in the driver's seat of her minivan. Leo was in his car seat in the back. That cold, primal cop instinct screamed in my head. Something is about to happen. I ran to the car, my supervisor, who had just arrived, right behind me. I tried the handle. Locked. I knocked on the window. "Clara, please open the door. Let's just talk." She ignored me, fumbling with the keys in the ignition. She turned and looked at her son in the back, and her placid expression finally broke. It contorted into a snarl of pure rage. "You will not take him from me," she screamed, the sound muffled through the glass. "You will not poison him too." Before I could even process what was happening, she unbuckled herself, scrambled into the back of the minivan, and threw herself on top of her son. I saw her press a decorative pillow from the front seat over his face. I saw his little legs start to kick. There was no more time for talking. I drew my baton and smashed it against the side window. The glass spiderwebbed but didn't break. I hit it again, harder, putting all my weight behind it. The window exploded inward. My supervisor was at the other door trying to get it open. I dove through the window, not even feeling the glass slicing into my arms and face. I grabbed her, trying to pull her off the boy. She was shockingly strong, fueled by a psychotic adrenaline. She fought back, scratching and biting. I finally got my arm around her neck and pulled her away. Leo was limp and blue. My supervisor got his door open, pulled Clara out of the car, and I immediately began CPR on the little boy. It was the longest minute of my life. Finally, he gave a choked, sputtering cough and started to cry. I carried him back into the facility, his small body trembling in my arms. When I looked back outside, Clara was on the ground in handcuffs, her face completely blank again, as if nothing had happened. She was just gone. The person who had been a loving mother only hours before had been erased, replaced by a monster that looked just like her. This happened back in 2018. I was working as an emergency response technician on an oil rig off the coast of Louisiana. Our emergency response team, or ERT, was called to an incident involving a small recreational boat that had capsized near the rig. Luckily, there was a supply ship in the port, which meant their tugboats were nearby. They were able to respond to the people in the water and pull them out before we even got there. It was a 20-minute drive from our main site to the port. When we arrived, we had to reverse the ambulance about 150 meters down a narrow, single-lane jetty. I was the officer in charge, and along with 3 other medics, I grabbed our response kits and extra thermal blankets. We made our way down to a lower boat landing, where we were handed life vests before being allowed to board the tugboat. Once on board, we were directed to the galley on the port side. Inside, 3 men who had been pulled from the water were resting. The galley was cramped, so the 2 tug workers who had been looking after them had to leave to make space for my team. They exited through the starboard galley door and stayed on the deck. Several other tug workers were also outside on various parts of the boat. When we entered the galley, it took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dim light. To my right, there were 2 booth-style tables bolted to the floor. There were 3 casualties in the room. 2 of them were on the floor in the narrow walkway. One was lying on his side right in front of me, and the other was on his back a little further down. Both were middle-aged and had numerous cuts and scrapes, likely from trying to climb back onto the nearby reef. The 3rd casualty was an older man sitting at the far table. His hands were clasped in front of him, his elbows resting on the tabletop. He was staring straight ahead with a blank, 1,000-yard stare. He had just as many visible injuries as the other 2, with deep cuts that clearly needed stitches. A significant amount of blood had pooled and congealed on the table around his clasped hands. I triaged the scene, assigning 1 medic to each of the men on the floor. My partner, Carlos, and I went to attend to the older man who was just sitting there. One of the other medics told us that the man on the floor he was working on had been very distraught earlier. He had apparently jumped into the water after his friend was washed in and kept repeating over and over that he had to save his son. He had only gone quiet a few minutes before we arrived. This older man at the table was his father. After several attempts to communicate with the older man, it was clear he was not responsive. He showed no sign of understanding or even hearing us. Carlos and I concluded that he was likely in shock and suffering from hypothermia. We attempted to place a thermal blanket over his shoulders while I tried to check his vitals and look for any life-threatening bleeding. That's when things got strange. The man looked my partner directly in the eyes and said, in a perfectly calm and steady voice, "You cannot resolve this. You are just occupying my presence. You need to let me keep going." Carlos and I exchanged a look we had shared many times before when dealing with hysterical or confused patients. But this man wasn't hysterical. He was completely calm, his voice unwavering, his fingers still interlaced. We just stared at each other, each waiting for the other to take the lead. After a few seconds, I composed myself and told him that he had been in an accident and that we needed to treat his injuries. I assured him that we would be at the hospital soon and that he could relax. In response, the man stood up with such abrupt force that the table he was leaning on broke free from its bolts on the floor. The tabletop slammed into my right leg, pinning me against the back of the seat. It wasn't a cheap or rotten table. He had stood up with such power concentrated on his thighs that he had literally snapped it loose. Carlos, who was crammed into the tight space with me, later told me he had reached out with one hand to steady the man and the other to grab the table. But the man was too fast. He pushed past Carlos and shot out the starboard galley door like a blur. I shoved the table off me, and Carlos and I followed just a second or two behind him. We searched the entire deck, ran up the stairs to the wheelhouse, but he was gone. There was no sign of him. No one outside the galley had seen anything. The man who had given us our life vests was still at his post and swore no one had passed him. The tugboat captain had been at the controls the entire time, keeping the boat steady against the dock. 3 other deckhands were positioned right outside the port and starboard galley doors, providing a complete view of the lower deck. All of them insisted they had not seen anyone leave the galley after we went in. We returned to the galley, confused and unsettled. We treated the other 2 casualties, who were then transferred to the hospital. At the debriefing, only myself, Carlos, and one of the other medics confirmed that the older man had been in the room. The 4th medic had been too focused on her patient and had no recollection of him. The official report from the tugboat crew stated that only 2 people had been pulled from the water. There was no 3rd casualty. I tried to follow up with the 2 survivors at the hospital afterwards, hoping to get some answers. I wanted to find out if they had seen him or if he was indeed one of their fathers. But my shifts ended, and by the time I had a day off to go to the hospital, they had both been discharged. A friend of mine who works at the hospital told me that there was nothing unusual about their cases, except for their behavior. One of the men was incredibly happy and grateful to be alive, while the other, the son, just sat silently by the window, refusing to eat or speak to anyone. To this day, I have no idea what happened on that tugboat. Carlos and I still talk about it sometimes, usually after a few drinks, but we are no closer to an answer. I suppose all we can do is wonder. I was a few years into my career as a police officer in a small coastal city in southern Georgia. It was one of those places that looked beautiful on postcards, but had a nasty underbelly that tourists never saw. Our main industry was the port, which meant a lot of transient people, and with them came a steady flow of crime. Car theft and breaking and entering were our bread and butter. Most nights were spent dealing with drunks, petty disputes, or kids causing trouble down by the marina. It was usually predictable. This particular night in late August 2023 was anything but. The air was thick and heavy, so humid you could practically swim through it. My partner, Dave, and I were in our patrol car, cruising through a quiet residential area on the west side of town. It was about 2 a.m, the time when the city finally seems to hold its breath. All I could hear was the low hum of the car's engine and the chirping of crickets that seemed to thrive in the oppressive heat. Dave was in the driver's seat, nursing a lukewarm coffee, and I was staring out the passenger window, watching the identical suburban houses slip by in the dark. The radio crackled to life so suddenly it made me jump. It was Brenda, one of our night shift dispatchers. Brenda was a rock. I had heard her handle hostage situations and multi-car pileups without a single tremor in her voice. But this time was different. Her voice was tight, and she was speaking faster than usual. All units, be advised, we have an intruders on premises call, priority 1. Intruders on premises was a call that always got your heart rate up. It meant someone was inside a house where they were not supposed to be, and the resident was there with them. It was a situation that could go from 0 to 100 in a split second. Dave immediately killed the conversation we were having about his kid's upcoming t-ball game and slammed his foot on the accelerator. We did not turn on the sirens yet. The last thing you want to do is spook the intruder and cause them to panic and hurt the homeowner. As we raced towards the address, Brenda's voice came back over the radio, feeding us more details as they came in from the call taker. The situation was chilling. The resident was a young woman, home alone. To beat the stifling Georgia heat, she had turned her air conditioning down as low as it would go and was bundled under a heavy comforter. She had been texting her cousin on her phone before she drifted off to sleep. A little while later, she woke up with that primal feeling that something was deeply wrong. When her eyes adjusted to the dark, she saw it. The silhouette of a man was standing in the corner of her bedroom, just watching her. In a moment of incredible self-control, she did not scream. She did not sit up. She instinctively knew that letting him know she was awake could be a fatal mistake. Instead, she shifted slightly, as if she were just stirring in her sleep, and pulled the covers up higher over her head. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but on the outside she was calm. Under the safety of her thick comforter, her hands blindly searched for her phone on the mattress. She found it, unlocked it with her thumb, and began texting her cousin, who was still awake. She typed out what was happening, her fingers trembling. "There is a man in my room. He is standing by the bed. Call 911 for me. Do not call me, just send the police." Her cousin immediately called 911 and relayed the information. The call taker was now in a three-way conversation, with the cousin passing on the terrified texts from the woman under the blanket. The details were sparse, but terrifying. The man was not moving much. He was just standing there. She could hear the soft sound of his breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards as he shifted his weight. Every minute that passed must have felt like an eternity for her, trapped in her own bed with a stranger just feet away. Dave and I were the first to arrive. We pulled up about a house down and cut the engine, plunging the street back into silence. Another patrol car slid to a stop behind us a few seconds later. In the darkness, I could see two other officers, Martinez and Chen, already moving on foot toward the front of the house. We got out of our car, our movements practiced and quiet. The plan was to surround the house and contain the threat. I remember the feeling of the damp grass under my boots and the weight of my firearm in my hand. As we were getting into position, the headlights of our car caught a flash of movement from the side of the house. A man was running from the back of the property. He was barefoot, and he scrambled across the driveway and onto the street. Martinez and Chen saw him at the same time we did, and immediately gave chase. "Police! Stop!" they yelled, their voices cutting through the night. The man was not built for running. He was heavy-set and clumsy, and his bare feet were clearly not happy with the rough asphalt of the road. Dave and I joined the chase, and it was over in less than a block. He stumbled, and we were on him, pushing him to the ground and getting him in handcuffs. As I helped haul him to his feet, I was struck by how utterly normal he looked. He was scruffy and looked like he had not showered in a few days, but there were no horns, no monster-like features. He was just a guy, an average, unremarkable man who had just subjected a woman to unimaginable terror. Later, back at the station, he admitted to everything. He told us he liked breaking into women's houses while they were asleep. He said watching them made him feel powerful. He enjoyed the act of violating their safest space, of stealing their sense of security. He would not say if he had ever done more than watch, but we all knew this was not the first time he had done this. There was a practiced ease about him that suggested this was a regular hobby. After he was processed, I drove back to the woman's house. She was sitting on her front porch, wrapped in a blanket, with a victim's advocate. Her cousin had arrived and was with her. I walked up and introduced myself and told her the man was in custody. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and trauma that I have seen too many times. She thanked me, her voice barely a whisper. I spent some time walking through the house with her, checking all the windows and doors, trying to give her back some small measure of control, but I knew it was not that simple. He had taken something from her that could not be replaced. He had stolen the feeling of being safe in her own home, in her own bed. As I left her house that night and got back in my patrol car, the heavy, humid air felt colder than before. The quiet suburban streets no longer seemed peaceful, but full of dark corners and hidden watchers. I grew up in a house where the silence was often heavier than any sound. My father was a detective in a worn-out industrial city in Ohio, and he carried the weight of his job home with him every night. He was not a man of many words, but his eyes told stories he never would. I learned to read the lines around them, the tightness in his jaw. Some nights he came home looking merely tired. Other nights, he looked like he had seen the end of the world. The story he told me about the frying pan came on one of those nights, years after it happened, when I was old enough to understand the different kinds of monsters that walk the earth. It was late 2018, and my brother was just a baby, maybe 6 months old. The memory for my father was still raw, still immediate. The call had come in just after he had gotten home, his shift technically over. It was a domestic disturbance, but with a reported child injury, which always escalated the response. The details were vague, just a screaming baby and a frantic mother. He told me he remembered the feeling of his boots on our home's floor, how he had just untied them, and the sigh he let out as he had to tie them right back up. He was a detective, not usually a first responder to this kind of call, but he was close, just a few blocks away from our own house, and every other patrol car was tied up. When he arrived at the apartment, the front door was open. The first thing that hit him was the sound. He had been to scenes with gunfire, explosions, and violent screams, but he said the sound of that baby crying was the worst thing he had ever heard. It was not a normal cry of hunger or pain. It was a constant, high-pitched shriek of pure agony that seemed to tear at the air itself. He found the mother in the living room, a young woman who looked like she was barely out of her teens. She was pacing back and forth, holding a phone to her ear but not talking, her eyes wide and unfocused. The baby was on the couch, wrapped in a thin blanket, and its screams were relentless. My dad, trained to assess and control a scene, went to the baby first. He unwrapped the blanket and saw it. On the baby's tiny stomach was a huge, red, weeping burn. It was a perfect circle. He knew instantly what it was. The shape was unmistakable. He looked from the burn to the kitchen, where a cast-iron frying pan was sitting on the floor. The mother, disconnected from the reality of the room, was rambling. Her boyfriend had gotten angry. The baby would not stop crying. He just wanted to make it stop. There was no time to wait for an ambulance. My dad wrapped the baby back up, grabbed the mother by the arm, and practically threw her into the back of his unmarked car. He drove, a controlled chaos of speed and precision, his siren cutting a path through the quiet residential streets. In the back seat, the mother's story came out in broken, hysterical pieces. The boyfriend, a man named Rick, had been drinking. He had yelled at her, yelled at the baby, and then he had taken the hot pan off the stove where she had been cooking dinner and pressed it down onto the baby's stomach. He had used the pan to pin the helpless child to the floor. The screaming had started then, and it had not stopped. The emergency room was a blur of motion. As soon as my dad entered carrying the screaming infant, nurses and doctors descended on them. The baby was whisked away into a trauma room. My dad was left in the hallway with the mother, who had finally collapsed into a fit of sobs. He was trying to get a coherent statement from her, trying to piece together the timeline, when the automatic doors to the emergency entrance slid open with a hiss. In walked the boyfriend. My dad described him as a walking cliché of toxic masculinity. He was a big man, built like a refrigerator, with a thick biker vest over a stained t-shirt and a collection of crude tattoos covering his arms. He reeked of stale beer and cigarettes. He strode into the waiting room with an air of absolute ownership, his eyes scanning the area until they landed on the mother. He was not there to check on the baby. He was there to retrieve his property. He started yelling at her, demanding she come with him, creating a scene that brought the activity in the waiting room to a halt. A nurse tried to intervene, telling him he needed to be quiet, and he shoved her hard against a wall. My dad was not in uniform. He was in a pair of jeans and a worn-out jacket. To this man, he was just some guy standing in the way. As the boyfriend advanced on the mother again, my dad moved to block him. The man laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Get out of my way, old man, before you get hurt." That was when my dad saw it, on a small metal cart next to him, a stainless steel bedpan. In one smooth motion, he picked it up and swung it like a bat, connecting with the side of the boyfriend's head with a sickening clang. The big man's eyes went wide with shock, and he dropped to the linoleum floor like a sack of rocks. His head was split open, a deep gash that was already starting to bleed profusely. The commotion brought hospital security and other officers, but the immediate threat was over. The doctor who came to deal with the boyfriend was the same one who was leading the team working to save the baby's life. My dad said he had never seen such cold, controlled fury in a person's eyes before. They took the boyfriend to a curtained-off bay to stitch up his head. My dad stood nearby and watched. The doctor prepared the needle and thread. The boyfriend, his tough guy act completely gone, started whining. "Hey, Doc, you gonna give me something for the pain? A shot or something?" The doctor looked up from his work, his face a mask of stone. "No," he said, his voice quiet but sharp. "I'm not." And then he began to stitch. The boyfriend's screams of pain echoed through the emergency room, pathetic and animalistic. He cried that it was cruelty, that it was against his rights. No one listened. No one cared. After what he had done to that baby, his pain was just a faint, insignificant echo of the agony he had inflicted. My dad said that in all his years of service, he never saw a more perfect or immediate form of justice. It was one of those calls that comes in looking completely routine. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost bored, as it came over the radio. Respond to a diabetic emergency. Male patient. Possible fall. My partner Fred and I had been on shift for about 10 hours, and we were running on coffee and adrenaline fumes. A diabetic call was something we could handle in our sleep. We drove through a quiet, middle-class suburban neighborhood, the houses neat and tidy, the lawns perfectly manicured. The wife met us at the door. She seemed agitated, her hands fluttering nervously as she led us through the house. "He just collapsed," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. "He's a diabetic. He must have hit his head when he fell." We found him laid out on the floor of their master bedroom. He was a large man, and he was lying flat on his back. As Fred started his assessment, I began setting up our equipment. Fred checked for a pulse and found nothing. "He's in arrest," he said, already reaching for the defibrillator pads. "Let's get him hooked up." My job was to stabilize the man's head and neck, standard procedure in case of a fall to prevent any further spinal injury. I knelt at the man's head, positioning my hands carefully on either side of his face and skull to hold him steady. The moment my fingers made contact, I knew something was horribly wrong. The back of his skull felt soft, spongy. As I applied gentle pressure to hold his head in the correct position, my fingers sank into something that felt like wet gravel. A wave of nausea and confusion washed over me. It took my brain a second to process the impossible tactile information. My fingers were not on his skull, they were in his skull. I was feeling the fragmented pieces of bone and the soft tissue of his brain. Fred was about to apply the defibrillator pads. "Ready to shock on 3, he said, his voice all business. "Fred, stop," I said, my own voice sounding distant and strange to my ears. "What?" "We need to shock him," he insisted, his focus entirely on the protocol. I took a slow breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "No, Fred," I said. "He's dead. My fingers are in his head." There was a profound silence in the room, broken only by the faint hum of the defibrillator. Fred froze, the pads hovering over the man's chest. He stared at me, his eyes wide with confusion. Then he looked down at my hands, at the man on the floor, and the horrifying reality of the situation slowly dawned on his face. It turned out the man had shot himself. He had put a pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. The wife, in a state of shock and denial, had cleaned up the scene, put the gun away, and then called 911, concocting the story about a fall. The police arrived shortly after and, upon discovering the truth, began a very different kind of investigation. I have been on countless calls. I have seen death in all its varied and brutal forms. But that one scene is burned into my memory with a unique and visceral horror. It wasn't just the sight of the aftermath, but the feeling, the sickening, unforgettable sensation of my fingers sinking into a man's brain, while his wife tried to convince us he had simply fallen down. It's a memory that my mind has never been able to fully scrub clean. I am a police constable in a mid-sized city in the UK, a place that has been slowly decaying since the factories closed down. My job, more often than not, is to be a witness to the quiet, desperate unraveling of people's lives. But there are days when the quiet desperation gives way to a kind of horror so profound and so multi-layered that it leaves a permanent stain on your soul. This was one of those days. The call started at the station. We had arrested a man named Kevin, a known petty thief, for going equipped for theft. He was caught in a back alley with a pair of bolt cutters and a bag of tools. It was a routine, low-level arrest. Kevin was sullen and uncooperative, but that was nothing new. He was just another lost cause, a familiar face in the endless, depressing cycle of crime and punishment. About an hour after we had booked him, a woman came into the front lobby. She was thin and weary, her face etched with a lifetime of worry. It was Kevin's mother. She was not there to ask about him, not really. She was there to ask about the children. "What's going to happen to the kids?" she asked the desk sergeant, her voice a low, anxious whisper. He's got them at the house." A cold, heavy silence fell over the booking area. The desk sergeant looked at me. I looked at my partner. Kevin had not mentioned any children. He had been asked, as all arrestees are, if he had any dependents who needed care. He had said no. The thought of 2 small children left alone in a house by a father who was now in a holding cell sent a jolt of pure, cold dread through all of us. My partner and I were in our car in seconds. The drive to Kevin's house, a small terraced house in a rundown part of the city, was a blur of rising panic. What would we find? How long had they been alone? The house, when we arrived, was a perfect reflection of the neglect we feared. The front garden was a jungle of weeds, a broken toy car lying on its side in the overgrown grass. The curtains were drawn, the paint was peeling, and a smell of stale rubbish seemed to seep from the very brickwork. We banged on the door, shouting, "Police! Is anyone in there?" There was no reply. I knelt down and shouted through the letterbox. The silence from inside was absolute. I was about to stand up, to make the call to force entry, when I saw a flicker of movement from the darkness inside. A small face, pale and grimy, with wide, frightened eyes, appeared in the opening. It was a little boy, no more than 3 years old. "Hello there," I said, my voice as gentle as I could make it. "Can you open the door for us?" He just shook his head, his eyes welling up with tears. "Are you here all by yourself?" I asked. He shook his head again. "No," he whispered, his voice a tiny, fragile sound. "My brother's here." That was all we needed. My partner used the big red magic key, our slang for the enforcer, a heavy steel battering ram, and the door splintered inward. The smell that hit us was a physical blow. It was a thick, gagging wave of ammonia, stale food, and human waste, so overpowering that I had to fight the urge to retch. The scene inside was a tableau of pure, unadulterated squalor. Every surface was covered in a thick layer of grime. Mountains of takeaway cartons, empty beer cans, and overflowing bin bags were piled in the corners. The floor was a minefield of dirty clothes, old newspapers, and used, overflowing nappies. In the middle of this disaster zone stood the little 3-year-old boy, and sitting on a stained, bare mattress on the floor was his little brother, a baby of about 18 months. The baby was not crying. He was just sitting there, a silent, vacant look on his face. His nappy was so full, so heavy with waste, that it had sagged down to his knees, its contents starting to seep up his back. My partner, a hardened veteran of 20 years on the force, just stood there for a moment, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. "Oh my God," he whispered. I went to the children. The little boy flinched as I approached. The baby did not react at all. I knew we had to get them out of there, but first they needed a drink. They were clearly dehydrated. I went into the kitchen, a room that was somehow even worse than the living room. The sink was piled high with mold-encrusted dishes. I searched the cupboards for a clean cup, a bottle of water, anything. I found a plastic toddler's cup, but when I picked it up, I saw that a thick, green layer of mold was growing on the inside. The refrigerator was empty, save for a half-eaten tin of cold-baked beans. We could not even give them a drink of water from the tap without risking their health. We called for the grandmother to come and collect them. While we waited, my partner went out and bought a bottle of water and a loaf of bread from a nearby shop. The boys drank the water like they had been lost in the desert. The older one devoured a piece of plain bread as if it were a feast. After the grandmother had arrived, her face a crumpled mess of tears and shame, and had taken the children away, our job shifted. The house was now a crime scene. We had to document the neglect, and we had to do a full sweep of the property. In the boys' bedroom, we found a single filthy mattress on the floor that they had clearly shared. In their father's bedroom, another layer of the horror revealed itself. In the corner, there was a small canvas grow tent with several cannabis plants inside, thriving under a hot, jury-rigged system of lamps and wiring. It was a fire hazard of terrifying proportions. If that mess of faulty wiring had sparked, this whole squalid tinderbox would have gone up in flames, and those two little boys would have been trapped inside. My job was to go through the house and switch off all the electronic appliances. I got to his computer, which was still running, humming away in the corner of his filthy bedroom. I moved the mouse to wake the screen up from its sleep mode, my only intention to shut it down properly. The screen flickered to life, and I was looking at a folder of images. The thumbnails were small, but the content was unmistakable. They were pictures of young children, girls between the ages of 12 and 13. They were naked. They were posed. It was child pornography. A wave of pure, cold rage washed over me. So profound it felt like a physical sickness. I had spent the last hour trying to bring some semblance of dignity to a scene of abject neglect, my heart aching for the two little boys who had been living in this filth. But this was a different category of evil. This was not neglect, it was predation. The man in our holding cell was not just a pathetic, drug-addled thief who was failing as a father. He was a monster. I took a picture of the screen with my phone and immediately called my partner, who was downstairs logging the evidence from the grow tent. "You need to come up here," I said, my voice low and tight. "Now. And you need to call the Tech Crimes Unit." The discovery changed everything. The house was no longer just a biohazard. It was the lair of a child predator. Every disgusting, squalid detail of the home took on a new, more sinister meaning. The chaos, the filth. It was the perfect camouflage, the perfect environment to break down a child's spirit, to isolate them, to make them invisible to the outside world. The rage that had been a cold, hard knot in my stomach began to burn. I thought of Kevin, sitting in his cell, probably complaining about the lack of a cigarette, completely unaware that his secret, filthy world was being laid bare. I had an almost overwhelming urge to go back to the station, to walk down to the holding cells, and to personally inform him that his life as he knew it was over. I wanted to see the look in his eyes when he realized we knew. Instead, I channeled that rage into my work. We sealed the room, turning the entire house into a much more serious crime scene. We went over every inch of it again, this time looking not just for evidence of neglect, but for cameras, for storage devices, for anything that could tell us the full scope of his depravity. Were his own sons victims? Were there others? Every broken toy, every stained piece of clothing, was now a potential piece of a much larger, darker puzzle. I left that house late in the evening, the air outside feeling impossibly clean and fresh. I went back to the station and wrote my report, my fingers flying across the keyboard, every sentence a hammer blow of clinical, factual rage. Kevin was eventually sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The boys, I heard, remained with their grandmother. They were safe, clean, and loved. But I often wonder about the things they saw, the things they experienced in that house of squalor. We had rescued them from the filth, but I knew, with a certainty that still keeps me up at night, that they had been born into a darkness that no amount of soap and water could ever wash away.